Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The night was still. Too still. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, the kind that follows an unspoken warning, one that you should have understood the moment you entered the forest. The trees were too dark, their towering silhouettes cut like jagged teeth against the blackened sky. High above, the clouds were dense, swollen with rain, clinging to the mountain peaks. Even the wildlife had stopped. No insects hummed, no birds fluttered in the canopy above. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. They were a group of 5, friends who had come here to escape, to forget for a few days, the weight of the world pressing against them. They had arrived earlier that afternoon, setting up their campsite by the river's edge, the water cascading over rocks with a soft, rhythmic lullaby. The campsite itself had been carefully selected, a wide, flat patch of land that stretched up to the water's edge, where they could pitch their tents and huddle around a fire. They had built it carefully, deliberately, ensuring that the river, though unpredictable, was a manageable presence, a comforting one. It had been a good day. The sun had shone through the gaps in the trees, dappling the ground with patches of light. The water had been clear, cool, inviting, and they'd spent hours fishing and swimming, laughing and talking. The forest had felt alive, full of possibility, but now, as the storm approached, something else was in the air. The wind had picked up, causing the trees to groan with deep, haunting moans, as if the forest itself was beginning to stir with discomfort. A distant rumble of thunder echoed through the sky, low and slow, vibrating the air with its ominous warning. Maggie, the eldest of the group, stood up from where she had been tending the fire. Her eyes, pale and wide, swept over the campsite. "We should get ready," she said, her voice softer than usual. The group hadn't missed the slight tremor in her words. Maggie had always been the pragmatic one, the one who tried to keep the peace, to keep things under control. But there was an unease in her posture now. Jake, her younger brother, pulled his jacket tighter around him. "It's just a storm. We've been through worse." "No," Maggie said, the unease deepening. She looked at the sky again, a flicker of something, fear maybe, crossing her face. "This isn't just any storm. We should move the gear to higher ground at least. I don't trust this weather." Ben, the quiet one, was already moving toward the tents, his eyes scanning the riverbank. "Maybe it'll pass." But Maggie shook her head. The others, as if sensing the growing tension, started to pack up, shifting uneasily as the wind began to pick up speed. The trees bent under the force of it, the leaves whistling and rustling, as if the forest itself was whispering secrets that none of them understood. The river, which had been calm earlier, now churned in a way that felt unnatural. The sound of the current had become louder, deeper, almost as though it was carrying a warning of its own. Water splashed against the rocks, foaming and twisting like it had a mind of its own. As Maggie watched, the water seemed to swell, rising higher along the bank, as though it too had been stirred into a frenzy by the growing storm. The thunder cracked again, this time much closer, vibrating the very ground beneath them. The storm was upon them, moving faster than they expected, and suddenly the forest no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a prison. The sky above them darkened, as if it were closing in. The distant rumble of thunder shifted to a growl, as though the heavens themselves were angry. The wind howled, sending waves of rain crashing down in torrents. The fire sputtered and died, replaced by the relentless, deafening roar of the storm. A deafening crack split the air, an enormous bolt of lightning. arced through the sky, momentarily illuminating the entire campsite in stark white brilliance. For an instant, the forest became a vast, twisted labyrinth of shadow and light, and in that brief flash, Maggie thought she saw something, no, someone, standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the tree line. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The momentary vision vanished, leaving only the storm and the howling wind. The group froze, each one of them staring at the dark line of trees, unsure of what they had just seen, or had they seen anything at all. "I didn't see anything," Jake said, shaking his head as if to clear it. "You must be imagining things." Maggie, however, couldn't shake the feeling. She felt a coldness creeping up her spine, a deep sense of dread that she couldn't explain. There was something in the air, something wrong, something waiting. "Let's just get everything packed," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "We need to get out of here." By the time they had everything packed up, the storm had fully unleashed its fury. The sky had turned black, the rain a thick, pounding wall. The wind was relentless, pushing against them as they worked to secure their gear. Even the tents felt flimsy, battered by the fierce gusts. They were about to head toward higher ground when a strange sound cut through the chaos of the storm. At first it was faint, like a low rumble, but then it grew, slowly, steadily, becoming clearer and louder, a deep, guttural sound, a sound that didn't belong. It was coming from the river. The campers froze. In the chaos of the storm, they couldn't understand at first, couldn't place the sound. But then it became undeniable. The water was moving faster. It was as if the river had grown alive, its currents swirling with a strange, unnatural force. They turned to face the riverbank, their hearts racing as the sound grew louder still. Something was coming. "Maggie," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "What is that?" She couldn't answer. She couldn't speak. She could only stare, wide-eyed, as the water surged forward. Something was happening. Something beyond natural forces. Something beyond the storm. And then, in one terrible instant, the floodwaters rose higher, faster, pushing against the edge of the river, as if the river itself had awakened. The current turned dark and ferocious, twisting and pulling with such force that it seemed to be dragging the earth itself into its depths. The sound was deafening now, a horrible roar that seemed to fill the very sky. And then, with one final, thunderous crash, the water swept across the land, swallowing everything in its path. The campsite was gone, and the forest fell silent once again. The world had become a blur of water, rain, and raw fear. It wasn't the flooding that had taken them by surprise. It was the speed. In mere moments, the river had gone from an idle, flowing stream to a monstrous force, as though it were alive and bent on sweeping everything in its path. The campers had barely enough time to react before the water surged, swallowing their campsite, their tents, and all their belongings in a vicious, unrelenting rush. Maggie's heart was hammering in her chest as she grabbed Ben's arm, dragging him backward, away from the edge of the riverbank. "We need to go now," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. The rain was coming down in sheets, and her soaked hair clung to her face as she frantically scanned the forest. The trees were bending under the weight of the wind, and the ground beneath her feet felt unstable, shifting as if the earth itself had been unsettled by the violence of the river. Jake was already several paces ahead, pulling Maggie's younger sister Ellie along by the wrist. The two of them ran, but it was as if the forest itself was conspiring against them. The trees seemed to close in, the underbrush thickening with each step. The ground was soft and treacherous, the wet earth sucking at their boots with every hurried stride. Behind them, the river roared, but it wasn't the sound of a natural river anymore. It was something darker, something deeper, as if the current itself were alive, growling like an ancient beast disturbed from its slumber. And that was the first thing they noticed when they reached the hill. There was no water where there should have been. The river, once a torrent, had vanished. The flood waters had receded, but there was no trace of the raging current that had threatened to consume them. All that remained was the dry, cracked earth of the riverbed. The stones, which had once been slick with water, now lay exposed, jagged and cracked like teeth. Ben was the first to speak, his voice shaky. Where did it go? Maggie's pulse raced as she stared out at the empty riverbed. The GPS on her phone, which had been malfunctioning earlier, was now showing the same thing, a river cutting through the land at their location. But there was no river. There was only the desolate, dry ground. That's not possible, Ellie muttered, her voice tight with disbelief. Maggie felt a lump rise in her throat. She had to stay calm. She had to make a plan. But nothing made sense anymore. Not the storm, not the river's sudden disappearance, and certainly not the sense of creeping dread that was rising inside her. The air felt different now, too thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the trees, waiting. But when she turned to look, there was nothing but the shadowed trunks of the pines, swaying unnaturally in the wind. Maybe it just... Jake started, his voice trailing off, and then he turned around, eyes wide with fear. His words were stuck in his throat. Behind them, at the very edge of the riverbed, something shifted, a shadow, dark, indistinct, and moving. Too quickly, too quietly. The campers froze. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening. The storm had subsided into a light drizzle, the air thick with the smell of wet earth, but the oppressive weight of the forest lingered. The shadow had disappeared just as quickly as it had appeared, but they all felt it, that sense of wrongness. It's just the trees moving, Jake said, trying to convince himself, but even as he said it, he knew he didn't believe it. Maggie was already looking around the group. "We need to go," she said again, her voice more insistent. The shock was starting to wear off, and with it came the clarity of necessity. They needed to leave the forest. They needed to find civilization. Ben shook his head. "How? We don't even know where we are anymore. The river's gone. The GPS is messed up. We can't even tell where we are. There's no way we can..." "Be lost," Maggie said, her voice growing more frantic. "The river should be there. I don't understand. There's no way it could have just disappeared. But it did. And now..." Her breath hitched as she looked at the dry riverbed once more. The eerie stillness had returned, and there was something so unnatural about it. "And now something's wrong. We need to leave. Now." Suddenly, a deep, low sound filled the air, distant but growing louder with each passing second. It was the rushing sound of water, the sound of a river that was supposed to be gone. The group turned sharply, their eyes wide, heartbeats quickening. The noise wasn't just the sound of rain or wind anymore. It was the unmistakable sound of water, rushing, flowing, and growing louder as if the river were coming back. But when they looked toward the riverbed, there was nothing. The dry earth remained empty, and yet the sound continued, deep and rushing, echoing through the trees. It sounded as though it was coming from all directions. "Do you hear that?" Ben whispered, his voice thin with fear. Before anyone could respond, the sound began to shift, becoming a growl. A deep, terrifying growl, as though something ancient, something powerful, was waking up beneath the earth. The forest around them began to vibrate as if the land itself was shifting. The trees creaked ominously, bending under the weight of an unseen pressure. Ellie took a step back, her face pale. It's not the river. It's something else." Maggie could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The oppressive air around them was thickening, the sounds of the forest turning into an inescapable symphony of dread. We need to. Her words faltered as a low, rumbling sound came from behind them, deep and relentless. The growl was unmistakable, now unmistakable in its unnaturalness. They turned as one. The river was back. The sight was impossible. The floodwaters, which had receded so quickly only moments before, were now rising again. The current churned in an unnatural way, moving too fast, far too quickly. It was as though the very earth had cracked open, allowing the river to pour back in, carrying with it a viciousness that didn't belong. The campers could only stare, frozen in place, as the water surged higher and higher, rising faster than the eye could comprehend. It wasn't just water that was coming back. It was something else, something darker. The water surged forward, a massive, twisting beast that seemed to obey no natural law. It was as though the earth itself had decided to reclaim something long lost, something that had been buried beneath the surface for years. The river, once a peaceful companion to their campsite, had become a thing of nightmares, an angry, vengeful force that tore through the earth with relentless speed, devouring the land in its wake. Maggie stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She grabbed Ben's arm and pulled him away from the rushing water, but the ground beneath their feet felt like it was shifting. It wasn't just the river, it was the entire forest. The trees were groaning, their branches rattling like bones in a forgotten grave, and the sound of the water rose to a deafening roar, drowning out everything else. "What's happening?" Jake's voice was strangled, his face pale and covered in rain. His eyes were wide with terror as he stared at the water rising impossibly fast. Maggie didn't know how to answer him. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something foul, something decayed, like the smell of old rotting leaves long left to rot in a forgotten corner of the world. But it was more than just the smell. There was a palpable sense of dread that seemed to settle over them all, pressing down on their chests, squeezing the air from their lungs. She looked at the water again, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was too fast, too unnatural. The river was supposed to rise gradually, not like this, flooding back in like a beast awakened from its slumber. It wasn't right. And then came the sound. Beneath the rushing roar of the water, beneath the howl of the wind, there was another noise, a low, guttural hum, almost imperceptible at first, but growing stronger with every passing second. It seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath them, and Maggie felt it in her bones, as though the earth was speaking in a language older than time itself. "Did you hear that?" Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. They all turned to her, eyes wide, desperate for any explanation. "What is that?" Ellie asked again, her gaze flicking nervously to the shadowed trees. "It's like the river is calling." Maggie couldn't speak. She didn't want to admit what she felt, what she knew deep in her gut. But she had to. She had to face it, even if it was the most terrifying thing she had ever considered. She nodded, her voice hoarse. "It's not the river. It's something else. Something's here with us." The growling sound grew louder now, a thick, vibrating noise that seemed to permeate every fiber of her being. The very air around them felt dense, like the weight of the world had suddenly increased, pressing down on them, closing them in. The trees were no longer just trees, they were watching them. They seemed to bend in unnatural directions, as if drawn toward some unseen force, their trunks creaking with a life of their own. Ben's eyes darted around the campsite, his breathing quick and shallow. He couldn't look away from the river. The water was rising higher, faster, as though it were chasing them. He shook his head in disbelief. "This doesn't make sense. Rivers don't just disappear and then come back like this. It's like it's alive." Maggie's heart was pounding. "That's what I've been trying to tell you. It's not just the water. It's something in the water. Something ancient. something that was here long before we came. She barely finished the sentence when the ground beneath them shuddered, a violent tremor that sent them all stumbling. The air seemed to thicken, vibrating with an unnatural hum, and the trees swayed even more violently, their branches twisting and bending as though some invisible force were pulling them. Ellie gasped. "What is that? What's happening to the trees?" They all turned their eyes to the canopy, watching in horror as one of the towering pines closest to them seemed to bend unnaturally. It wasn't the usual sway of a tree caught in the wind. No, this was something else. The trunk creaked, splitting down the middle with a horrible, sickening snap, as if the tree was being torn apart from the inside. From the break in the trunk, dark, thick liquid began to seep out, almost like sap, but black as night. It pooled on the ground, spreading rapidly, the air thickening with the smell of decay. The liquid shimmered for a moment in the dim light, almost as though it were alive, before the tree groaned again and collapsed in a heap. None of them moved. They stood frozen, staring at the fallen tree, unsure whether to run or stay, unsure whether it was even safe to breathe. "This is wrong," Jake said softly, his voice full of dread. "This is all wrong. We need to get out of here. We need to leave right now." But even as he spoke, the water continued to rise. The river had almost reached the edge of the hill where they had taken refuge, and it was pulling at the earth, carving deep gouges into the land, as though it were eager to swallow them whole. The water wasn't just filling the riverbed now. It was spilling over, rushing across the land, reclaiming everything in its path. And then, as they stood there, staring at the river, they saw it, a figure, a shadow, emerged from the water. It was tall and formless at first, like a mirage, its edges blurring in the rising mist. But then it began to solidify, becoming more distinct as it rose from the flood. It was dark, towering, and utterly wrong. Its outline seemed to shift constantly, as though it could not decide what shape it wanted to take. It wasn't human. No, it wasn't even alive in the way they understood life. It was something older, something ancient and primal, something tied to the very river itself. The air seemed to freeze as the creature began to move, its limbs long and sinewy, bending and stretching like branches in a windstorm. It was pulling itself from the depths of the water, each movement deliberate, almost patient. The sound of its approach was like the groaning of the earth, like the breaking of bones. Ben stumbled back, his face pale. This isn't real," but it was real, and it was coming for them. Ellie screamed. It wasn't a sound of just fear. It was the kind of scream that held pure terror, a scream that came from the deepest, most primal place in the soul. And when she screamed, the creature's head twisted toward her, its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowing like dying embers, burning with malice. Maggie couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The sight of that thing, that dark entity rising from the depths of the river, was like looking into the face of something that should never exist. "Run," she screamed, her voice breaking the spell that had gripped them all. They turned and ran, their footsteps splashing in the rising water. But no matter how fast they moved, they could feel it, following them. The oppressive weight of its presence was suffocating, like the very earth had been pulled from under them. The creature's growl echoed through the forest. It was coming for them. The forest was closing in on them, the thick trees twisted and looming, bending in unnatural ways. The water surged at their heels, pushing them forward with an urgency that they couldn't escape. But no matter how fast they ran, they couldn't outrun the feeling that something was watching them, something ancient and malevolent, closing in on them with every breath. Maggie could hear her breath echoing in her ears, sharp and ragged, as her heart pounded relentlessly in her chest. The river was still rising, the sound of its churning waves growing louder and every step she took seemed to sink deeper into the soaked earth. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see that terrible shadow trailing them, but there was nothing there. At least, nothing visible. Yet it was there. She could feel it in the air, that same heavy presence, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. The trees seemed to lean toward them as though eager to swallow them whole, the darkness between the trunks thickening as if the night itself were closing in. "We have to find shelter," she gasped, her words almost drowned by the howling wind. "We can't keep running forever." But Jake, panting heavily beside her, shook his head in confusion. "What's happening?" His voice was a mixture of disbelief and fear. How could it just vanish? The river. It shouldn't be gone like that. And now this thing, this creature. Maggie didn't have an answer. She could feel the edge of panic creeping up her spine, clawing at her thoughts. There was no explanation for what had just happened. Rivers didn't vanish. Water didn't behave like that. It didn't rise and fall at the will of something unseen, but they couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. "Focus," Maggie snapped, her eyes darting around. The sound of the river's growl seemed to be coming from all directions now, vibrating through the air like a low, warning hum. "We need to get to higher ground. We need to get out of this forest." Ben, his face drawn with fear, glanced over, his shoulder nervously. "But what if it's not the forest we need to escape from? What if it's the river? What if this is part of something older? Something we can't understand?" Maggie stopped dead in her tracks. Ben's words hit her like a slap. She had been running on instinct, driven only by fear. But now, his words echoed in her mind. Something older, something beyond comprehension. The forest had felt wrong from the start, too silent, too still. It was as if the entire land was alive, watching them. And now the water, the river, had returned, not as it once was, but as something twisted and unnatural. It had changed. They had changed. "I don't care what it is," Maggie said, her voice firmer now despite the coldness creeping into her bones. "I care about getting out. We need to leave this place. We need to find help." "There's no time to waste." Ben opened his mouth to protest, but the words never came. Instead, he looked past her, his face going pale. The others followed his gaze, and what they saw froze them in place. It wasn't the river they had been running from. It wasn't the sound of the water rising that had caused the unease. It was the land itself, as though it had come alive. The trees were moving, shifting. The shadows between the trunks lengthened, stretching toward them like fingers curling and twisting in the low light. The very ground beneath them seemed to ripple, as if some invisible force was tugging at the earth, warping it. And then came the sound again, the growl, only now it was deeper, more pronounced. It was coming from below, from the earth itself, vibrating through the ground like the rumble of thunder beneath their feet. "Get away from the trees," Jake shouted, his voice wild with panic. But before they could react, the ground beneath them cracked open with a sudden, violent tremor. The earth split wide, the jagged opening like the gaping maw of some terrible creature. From the crack, dark, viscous liquid began to pour forth, swirling like a thick black tar, spilling across the ground, creeping toward them with a speed that was almost impossible to comprehend. The smell hit them immediately, pungent and foul, like something long dead. Maggie felt bile rise in her throat. The liquid wasn't just pouring out of the crack, it was moving, as though it had a mind of its own, slithering like some kind of living thing. And when it touched the dry earth, it spread, bubbling and hissing as it made contact, as if the soil itself were resisting its presence. "What is this?" Ellie screamed, her voice cracking in terror. "What is that stuff?" Maggie grabbed Ellie's arm and pulled her back. "We need to keep moving," she said. her voice tight with urgency. "Don't touch it. Don't let it get near you." But Ben, his face pale with dread, was still staring at the crack in the earth, his eyes wide with horror. "It's the river," he whispered. "It was the river. The water. It didn't just vanish. It went underground. It's..." His voice broke off, drowned by another earth-shattering rumble, louder this time. The crack widened and something huge began to emerge from the depths. It wasn't the river's water, though. No, this was something else, something far darker, more sinister. The liquid seemed to pulse, to breathe, as it rose higher, until the ground itself seemed to split open further. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just water. It was alive. The dark, writhing mass of liquid that had risen from the earth was now taking shape. Something dark, massive, and incomprehensible was emerging from the depths. It was like a shadow made of water and stone, shifting, growing. The growl, no, the hum that had been vibrating the air grew louder, closer, until it filled their ears like a deep, low chant. Is it the river?" Ellie gasped, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were wide with fear, her skin pale, as she stared at the dark entity that was emerging from the earth. Maggie didn't know. She didn't care to know. All she knew was that they had to get out of here. There was no logic, no explanation that made sense. The rules of the world they knew no longer applied. This forest, this place, it was something else entirely. "It's not the river," Maggie said, the words coming out in a choked whisper. "It's something far worse." Ben's face contorted in confusion and fear. But how? How could this happen? How could this thing just appear like this? Maggie's eyes filled with dread. "We shouldn't have come here," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were never supposed to be here." Her words hung in the air for a moment, sinking in like the oppressive weight of the earth beneath their feet. They all knew it now. There was something they didn't understand about this place. Something ancient, something wrong, and that something was hunting them. The forest had become a living nightmare. The trees, once a sanctuary of shade and peace, were now grotesque witnesses to the unfolding horror. Their branches twisted, reaching out like skeletal arms, clawing toward the sky, as if the forest itself were aware of the ancient presence now awake beneath the ground. The oppressive darkness of the storm had given way to an eerie twilight, the dim light only amplifying the unnerving sounds around them. Maggie's feet slipped in the mud, the wet earth pulling at her boots, but she kept moving. She had to. She had to keep moving. The others followed her in silence, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the primal terror that had taken hold of them. They were running from something they could not fully comprehend, from something that defied all logic, and yet it was chasing them. The air was thick, heavy with moisture and fear, and the distant hum, the low, rumbling growl that had started as an almost imperceptible vibration beneath the earth, was now growing louder. The ground trembled with each passing moment, as if it too was trying to escape the entity that was rising from the depths. The very air itself seemed to vibrate, the sensation crawling under their skin, tightening their throats, until it was almost unbearable. Jake stumbled ahead, his face twisted in panic. "What is that sound? What is that thing?" His voice cracked with raw terror. Maggie didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. It wasn't just a creature. No, this was something older, something that had lain dormant for centuries, waiting for the right moment to awaken. It was tied to the river, to the land, to something that none of them could understand. It had existed long before they ever set foot in this forest. Ben glanced over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously. "It's following us," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We can't outrun it." The words sent a shiver of dread through Maggie. She didn't want to believe it, but she had no choice. The thing was coming for them. It was patient, relentless. It was hunting. "I know," Maggie breathed, her voice tight with fear. "But we can't stop. We have to keep moving." They reached the edge of the forest, but even there, the nightmare didn't end. The trees thinned out, revealing a small clearing, but instead of a safe haven, it felt like a trap. The ground was uneven, the earth cracked and dry, as though the forest itself was rejecting them, pushing them out. There was no way to escape, no clear path, only the unnerving stillness of the open space. Maggie's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she looked around. In the distance, she could still hear the hum, the low, dissonant growl. It was no longer just a sound. It was a presence. It was everywhere, crawling through the trees, filling the air, vibrating the very ground beneath them. It was coming for them. And then, for the briefest of moments, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The sudden stillness was more terrifying than the growl. Maggie froze, her body tense, every muscle coiled with fear. She looked to the others, her eyes wide, as they too halted, listening. The wind had died down. The storm that had ravaged the forest only moments ago seemed to have disappeared, leaving behind an unnatural calm. "Do you hear that?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. Maggie nodded slowly, her senses on edge. There was something else now, a deeper, more disturbing sound. It was soft at first, a barely audible rustling, like the movement of leaves, but it wasn't coming from the trees, it was coming from the earth. The ground beneath them was shifting, vibrating again, but this time it was different. It was a whisper, a voice. Maggie's skin crawled as the whisper grew louder, its words indistinct but undeniably human, a low murmur that seemed to slip through the cracks in the earth itself. "Do you hear it?" Ben whispered, his voice barely a breath. His face was twisted in confusion. "What is that? What's it saying?" "I don't know," Maggie answered, her throat tight with unease. She had felt it, felt the vibrations beneath her feet, felt the pulse of something alive, calling to them, drawing them in. The sound was calling them, beckoning them closer, but there was no way forward, no path leading out of the clearing, no refuge, no salvation. The growl returned, louder now, deepening, resonating with a guttural intensity that shook the very air around them. It was more than just a sound. It was an entity, an intelligence, and it was speaking to them. But the words were no longer incomprehensible. The whispers became clearer, the words echoed in her mind. "Come closer. We have been waiting. Come closer, and you will understand." The others didn't hear it, not in the same way. They didn't feel the pull, but Maggie did. She felt the weight of it in her chest, in her bones, a compulsion that tugged at her very soul, urging her to step closer to the epicenter of the sound. She resisted with every ounce of her being. She could not go near it. "We need to go. Now," Maggie said, her voice urgent, shaking with terror. "It's trying to pull us in." But it was already too late. From the center of the clearing, the ground split open again, the earth cracking wider this time, exposing the dark, oily liquid that had begun to pool from the river's depths. It bubbled and writhed, swirling in unnatural patterns as though it were a living thing. It moved with purpose, seeping through the cracks, reaching out toward them, pulling the soil apart like it was tearing the world itself asunder. And then, from the center of the crack, a figure rose. It was tall, impossibly tall, the shape of it shadowed and indistinct. At first it appeared as nothing more than a collection of shadows, an ethereal figure that flickered in and out of existence. But as it fully emerged, it solidified into something darker, something far more sinister. Its form was obscured by the black liquid that had poured forth from the earth, but its presence was undeniable. It was there, and it was growing. The hum that had been vibrating through the air now shifted to a sound Maggie could not describe. Deep, guttural, alive. A voice that seemed to echo from every direction, surrounding them, filling the air. It spoke to them in a language they couldn't understand, its tone harsh and unyielding, but it didn't need words. They felt it. The river wasn't just a body of water. It was a conduit. It was the gateway to something much older, much darker. Something that had existed long before humanity had ever dared to tread upon its banks. And it was awakening. Maggie's body trembled as the realization hit her. They weren't just running from a flood. They weren't just running from a supernatural force. They were running from the very earth itself, from the thing that had been buried for centuries. The thing that had waited patiently for the right moment to rise again. And that moment was now. The creature that emerged from the earth was no longer an ambiguous shadow, but a towering presence, a force of nature, half born from the depths of the river, half from the soil itself. It moved with an unsettling, slow grace, its limbs stretching, unnaturally long, bending and twisting in ways that no living thing should be able to. The black liquid that had poured from the earth now surrounded its form, swirling around it like a cloak, shifting, pulsating, almost as if it were a part of the creature itself. Maggie could barely breathe. The air felt thick, oppressive, like she was choking on it. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. It was trembling, vibrating with an alien rhythm that made her insides lurch. The creature's form loomed larger, a shadow against the dying light of the sky, its eyes glowing faintly, burning with an ancient malevolence. The sound of the growl filled the air, vibrating in her bones, rattling her skull. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Maggie stood frozen, her mind racing, trying desperately to grasp the situation, to find an explanation. But there was none. No rational thought, no logic. There was only the presence of something older than any of them. Something that defied every law of nature. Behind her, Ellie's voice cracked in terror. "What is it? What is it?" Jake was staring at the creature, eyes wide, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "We need to run! Now! Before it does anything!" But Maggie couldn't move. The pull, the presence of the creature, was too strong. It wasn't just a fear she felt. It was something else. A compulsion, a tug in her chest, as though the earth itself was reaching out to her, calling her forward. "No," she said, her voice strained. "No, we have to stay. We have to understand." The others looked at her as though she had lost her mind, but Maggie's gaze was fixed on the creature before them. She couldn't explain it, couldn't understand what was happening, but something inside her had shifted. She felt like she was on the verge of remembering something buried deep in her subconscious. A fragment of a forgotten story, of ancient warnings whispered by the forest itself. And then, through the swirling black liquid and the hum of the creature's presence, she heard it again. The whispering, soft, faint at first, but growing clearer, with every passing second. "Come closer. Understand what lies beneath the surface." It wasn't just a whisper anymore, it was a call. A summons. The liquid around the creature began to move again, snaking toward them like tendrils, curling through the cracks in the earth. Maggie watched in horror as it crept closer, but strangely, she didn't feel the immediate instinct to run. No, there was a part of her that wanted to know, to understand what this thing was, and why it had been awoken. It was then that the truth began to reveal itself. Maggie's mind flashed back to their arrival in the forest. The odd sense of quietness, the feeling that something was watching them, the unease that had settled into her bones. It all clicked together like pieces of a broken puzzle falling into place. She had been drawn to this place just like everyone else, but she had felt something in the air, a pull, a faint hum in the distance, as though the river itself had been whispering to her. This river was never meant to be approached. It was never meant to be disturbed. Her pulse quickened as a flood of memories rushed into her mind. Stories she had heard as a child, stories that she had always dismissed as mere superstition, ancient legends about a river that ran through the land, a river that carried more than just water, a river that was the lifeblood of the land, feeding on the energy of the earth, the soul of the forest itself. But there was more. The river had always been guarded, protected. It was not just a source of water, it was a boundary, a line between the world of the living and something much darker, something ancient that had long been sealed away beneath the earth. The river had been a keeper of that secret, flowing with the blood of the land, never meant to be disturbed by outsiders. Until now. And now, standing before her, was the creature that had been birthed from the river's depths. It was not a monster in the traditional sense. It was the river itself, the manifestation of everything that had been buried, forgotten, and sealed away. It was the forest's curse, the ancient force that had been slumbering beneath the earth, waiting for someone to wake it. And now it had awakened, and it was furious. It's the river, Maggie whispered to herself, her eyes widening as the realization hit her like a crashing wave. It's not just water, it's alive. Ben's face was a mask of confusion and fear. What are you talking about? What do you mean it's alive? But Maggie wasn't listening. She could feel the power of the creature, the river, pulsing in the air around her, reaching out to her like an old, forgotten memory. She was connected to it now, just as it was connected to the land. This was no longer about survival. It was about understanding, about facing something beyond their comprehension. The creature let out a low, vibrating growl, a greeting. It was not an attack. Not yet. The whispering grew louder, more urgent now. Come closer. Understand. Accept what you are meant to know. Maggie took a hesitant step forward. Her body moved without her full consent, pulled by the same force that had drawn her here in the first place. She felt a presence, not just around her, but within her, like the river's essence was pouring into her very being, mingling with her thoughts, her soul. And then, as she took another step, something incredible happened. The earth trembled violently beneath her feet, and the liquid, no, the river, reared up like a massive wave, rising toward her. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. She was no longer on solid ground. She was standing at the edge of something ancient, something primal. The boundary had blurred, and she was teetering on the brink of understanding the secret the river had been holding for so long. The others screamed at her, but the words were lost in the overwhelming sound of rushing water, of a vast, churning force that filled the air. The ground cracked open beneath them, and they were no longer just running from the creature. They were falling into the abyss, the deep, dark place where the river's secret had been buried for centuries. Maggie reached out with trembling hands, feeling the force pulling at her, trying to connect. And for the briefest of moments, she saw it, a vision, a glimpse of the world beyond, where the river flowed not just through the earth, but through time itself, carrying with it memories, secrets, and lives long lost. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The creature, the river, had released its hold on her. She staggered back, her body trembling, as the land around her seemed to return to its natural state, silent, still, and empty. The moment had passed, but the knowledge remained, like a shadow in her mind. The river had shown her its secret. But now the truth was too heavy to bear. The others were still frozen, staring at her in confusion and terror. "Did you see it?" Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not just a river. It's the land itself. The life, the soul of the forest." Jake shook his head, unable to comprehend. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here now." But Maggie stood still, her mind racing with the revelation. The river was no longer just a force of nature. It was a gate, and they had crossed it. And now there would be no turning back. Maggie's body still trembled with the weight of what she had experienced. The vision, the connection to the river, to the land itself. It lingered in her mind like a ghost, clawing at her thoughts, refusing to let go. But there was no time to process it, no time to understand fully what she had just encountered. The others were still staring at her, eyes wide with fear. But Maggie felt something inside her shift. It was as though her mind had crossed a threshold, stepping into a world beyond her own understanding. The creature, the river, wasn't just a physical force. It was a presence that existed on a deeper level. It was ancient, sentient, and angry. It wasn't a thing to be escaped. It was a thing that was part of the very fabric of this land. And they had awakened it. Maggie tried to speak, but her voice cracked, weak and strained. "We need to keep moving," she said. Her words rushed, desperate. Her feet felt rooted to the earth beneath her, as though it were pulling her in, urging her to stay. But she shook herself free. The urgency in her voice was enough to make the others snap to attention. But even as she spoke, she could feel it, the tug, the presence of something else. The ground beneath them trembled again, but this time it wasn't just the creature. This time it was different. There was an unnatural force moving beneath them, creeping through the soil, through the very roots of the trees, as though something was reaching out, caressing the land, drawing it in closer. The whispering began again, soft at first, but building, growing louder with each second. It was a deep, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through her body, not just in her ears, but in her chest, in her very soul. The others turned, looking around nervously. The forest, which had been so silent before, now seemed alive. The trees creaked and groaned, their limbs bending unnaturally, swaying as though they were alive, straining towards something. The once still air began to stir, heavy with a thick, musty scent, like something had risen from the earth itself. "What is that?" Ben asked, his voice trembling as he took a step back. "I don't know," Maggie whispered, her eyes scanning the surrounding trees, the darkness between them. "But we're not alone. We never were." The ground shook again, harder this time, and something rose from the earth. It was subtle at first, a ripple in the ground, a slight bulge beneath the soil, but it grew quickly until the very earth was moving. From beneath their feet, thick black tendrils began to emerge, like the fingers of some great unseen beast. The tendrils curled and twisted, reaching upward, pulling themselves from the depths of the ground, as though the earth itself was alive. Ellie screamed, stumbling backward. "What is that?" Maggie's heart raced as she watched the tendrils extend, thick and black as tar, pushing through the cracks in the ground like roots searching for something. It wasn't just the creature of the river. It was the land itself. The force that had stirred from beneath the earth was alive, an ancient, malevolent power that had been dormant for so long. It had been slumbering beneath the river, buried under layers of earth and water, waiting. And now, it was reaching out. "Run!" Maggie shouted, her voice raw with fear. But there was nowhere to run. The tendrils were everywhere now, sprawling across the land, thickening and expanding with terrifying speed. They crept toward the group, slow and deliberate, as though the earth itself was reaching for them. The ground beneath their feet buckled, sending the group stumbling backward, but the tendrils were faster, wrapping around tree trunks, curling through the earth toward them. Ben made a desperate attempt to pull them away from the tendrils, but the earth was slippery, like quicksand. They couldn't escape. The forest had shifted. The world they had known was no longer real. The rules of nature, of physics, had all but dissolved, and they were caught in a nightmare where the land itself was alive and hunting them. Jake's voice was frantic as he grabbed Maggie's arm. "We need to get to the river. We need to leave. It's the only way. Maybe it's the only place left that's still safe." But Maggie shook her head, her gaze fixed on the ever-expanding tendrils. "The river is what brought us here. It's not safe." Ellie collapsed to her knees, sobbing, her hands clutching her head, as if she could will the sound, the vision, the pull to stop. "What do we do, Maggie? What do we do?" But Maggie didn't have an answer. She could feel the weight of the land bearing down on them, could feel the presence growing stronger. It was as if the forest had turned into a living entity, its very cells shifting and pulsating with dark energy. The trees creaked as if they were alive, watching, waiting, and then, without warning, the tendrils shot upward, crashing into the trees, bending them like fragile twigs. They twisted and turned, seeking, stretching toward the group, wrapping around the forest like a predator ensnaring its prey. Something darker stirred beneath the earth. A deep, resonant growl filled the air, vibrating through the land, through the trees, until it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. It wasn't just the river now. It was the force of the land itself, awakened, rising to take back what had been disturbed. They were trapped. Maggie's mind raced. She could hear the growl, feel it, vibrating through her bones. But now something was different. The tendrils weren't just reaching for them. They were reaching for something else, something deeper, something more primordial. The land was trying to reclaim its balance. The river was not the only part of the curse. The entire forest, the earth itself, had been a vessel, a boundary between worlds, and they had crossed it, and now the land wanted its price. "No!" Maggie cried out. "We need to stop it. We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The land was pulling them into itself, the earth bending around them, closing in. The air became thick, suffocating. The trees bent lower, their branches scraping the ground, their leaves rustling like whispers. Then, as though to confirm her worst fear, the ground split once more, this time wider, deeper, and from the fissure emerged something truly horrific. It was not a creature nor a force of nature, but the river's ancient guardian, a shape born of water, stone, and earth, its form shifting between all three, as though it were neither fully one nor the other. It was an entity, a force that had existed long before human eyes had ever looked upon this land. Its eyes were endless, two black voids that seemed to swallow the light around them, and they were locked on Maggie. The others screamed, but their voices were drowned out by the roaring sound of the creature's awakening. Maggie took one last breath as the ground around them began to close in, as the earth itself reached out to claim them. And then, as the river's final guardian stepped forward, a horrible thought filled her mind. They had never truly been lost. They had been chosen. The ground beneath Maggie's feet trembled once more, but this time, it wasn't just a simple shaking. It felt like the earth itself was shifting, warping around her as though it were alive, pulling her deeper into its grasp. The air grew thick, suffocating with the weight of something ancient and unstoppable. The trees, those towering, gnarled sentinels, seemed to stretch toward her, their limbs bending unnaturally, their leaves rustling like whispers. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was dread. The kind of dread that gnawed at your insides. The kind that left you feeling like you were drowning, like you were suffocating in a reality that was slowly unraveling around you. She tried to move, tried to run, but the ground wouldn't let her. Every step felt heavier, as though the very soil was pulling at her, trying to drag her down, to swallow her whole. Her feet sank into the mud, the earth clinging to her boots as if it wanted to keep her here, trapped. The others were with her, Ben, Jake, Ellie, but they too were frozen, their faces pale with terror. They couldn't move either, not with the weight of the forest pressing in on them, not with the presence that surrounded them. And then the whispers began again. Faint at first, like the soft murmur of the wind, but then it grew louder, clearer, until it felt like the land itself was speaking to her, pulling her towards something beneath the surface. The hum of the river, the growl of the guardian, filled the air, a dark rhythm that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth itself. "Do you hear it?" Ellie whispered, her voice shaky. "What is that sound? It's like the trees are alive." Maggie didn't respond. She didn't need to. She could feel it now. Everything was alive. The forest, the river, the earth. Everything was connected, bound together by something that had existed long before they had even set foot in this place. Something that had waited for them. "Maggie." Ben's voice was tight with fear. He reached out for her, his hand trembling. "What's happening? This isn't real. This can't be real. We can't be stuck here." But Maggie didn't know how to answer him. She could feel it now, deep within her soul. A pull, a force that had been there all along, tugging at her, calling to her. It wasn't just the river, not just the guardian. It was the land itself, the very fabric of time, all converging around them. And then, with an agonizing clarity, it hit her. This wasn't a forest. This wasn't just a place in time. It was a prison. The curse of the river had trapped them, not just in space, but in time itself. The land, the trees, the guardian, they were all part of something ancient, something that existed outside the flow of time as they understood it. The forest was the boundary between the living and the forgotten, the boundary between now and then. Maggie closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath, but the realization was like a punch to the gut. They weren't just trapped in this moment. They were trapped in time, caught in the past, in a moment where the river's curse had never been broken. They were not just intruders. They were part of it now. "It's time," the voice of the guardian echoed in her mind. It was not a sound she could hear with her ears, but one that vibrated deep within her bones, in the marrow of her soul. "You were always meant to come, to remember. You are the ones who will wake what has been buried." The ground beneath them cracked open again, wider, deeper, and the black tendrils surged forth, faster this time, wrapping around trees, pulling at the soil, twisting the earth like it was made of clay. They stretched toward Maggie and the others, as if reaching for them, tugging them deeper into the curse. The land was bending, reshaping itself, and with it, the very fabric of reality was warping. Maggie could feel the pull, feel the edges of the world starting to blur and fray, as though time was stretching, tearing, and they were caught in the rift. "No," Maggie whispered, her voice shaking, her heart racing. This can't be happening. We're not part of this. We have to leave. We have to get out of here." But the land wasn't listening. The pull was too strong, too overwhelming. The ground beneath them began to rise, slowly at first, but with an unnatural purpose, until the trees around them tilted, bending like they were reaching toward them. And that was when Maggie saw it, the river. It was no longer the small, winding stream they had camped beside. No, it had become something else. It was vast, impossibly so, stretching beyond the horizon, a black chasm of swirling water, its surface shimmering with an eerie, unnatural light. The water rose higher, pulling at the land as though the river itself was reclaiming the world. Maggie tried to move, but the ground held her fast. She could feel the earth wrapping around her legs, her feet sinking deeper, like the land itself was claiming her, pulling her into its embrace. "We can't escape, can we?" Ben's voice was barely audible. his words filled with a terrible resignation. He had seen it too. The river, the land, the force that had trapped them in this reality. "No," Maggie breathed. "We can't. We—" Her voice faltered as the truth settled over her like a weight. We were never meant to escape. The trees groaned louder now, the whispers of the land growing more frantic. It wasn't just time they were trapped in, it was a cycle. The river, the land, the guardian. They were all part of an eternal loop, one that had been repeating itself for centuries, and now they were part of it. Maggie's body shuddered with the cold realization. The forest had always been waiting for someone to awaken it, to cross the boundary. And now they were caught in its grasp. There was no going back, no way out. The land was rewriting itself, and they were becoming part of it. A final growl from the river, the guardian's voice, rumbled through the earth, shaking the ground beneath them. Its power swelled, a massive wave of energy crashing through the forest. Time twisted and fractured. The cycle was repeating, and they had become part of the river's curse. Maggie looked at the others, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror, and she realized something. They weren't just trapped in the forest. They were trapped in history, trapped in the curse that had been alive for centuries. They would never escape. They would become part of the land's forgotten memories, lost to time. The forest groaned one final time, and as the water rose to swallow them whole, Maggie heard the whisper in her mind again, clearer than ever before. You were always meant to come, and now you will never leave. The land was no longer solid. It was fluid, malleable, as though it had become a living thing, a massive organism that had wrapped itself around their bodies, around their souls. The ground churned beneath their feet, the soil squelching as if it were breathing. The trees, bent at impossible angles, seemed to lean in closer, whispering their ancient secrets in a language none of them could understand. The black tendrils that had risen from the earth twisted and coiled, snaking through the underbrush, creeping toward them with deliberate malice. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around, trying to process the reality she was in. The river was no longer a mere body of water. It was an entity, an endless dark current that stretched across the horizon, its waters churning violently, glowing with an otherworldly light. It was a creature of chaos, of time itself, and it had been waiting for them. Her pulse quickened, the truth sinking into her bones. They were trapped in its current now. There was no going back. The others stood frozen beside her, their faces etched with fear, their eyes wide with the terror of their fate. But there was something else there. Now something heavier, a feeling of helplessness, of inevitability. They were caught, bound to the curse of the river, and there was nothing they could do to escape. Ben's voice was tight, strained with panic. "Maggie, we need to get out of here. This isn't real. It's real, Ben," Maggie interrupted, her voice thick with the weight of what they were about to face. She could feel the pull of the land, the river, wrapping itself around her mind like a vice, drawing her into the depths of its terrible truth. She wanted to run. She wanted to escape. But she knew it was futile. They were part of the cycle now. They had always been part of it. The river. "It's not just water," Maggie whispered, her voice trembling with the revelation. "It's a boundary, a gate, a curse that has been here longer than any of us can understand. We're part of it now." The others looked at her, confusion and fear in their eyes, but Maggie felt no need to explain further. She could feel the presence of the river, of the land itself, reaching out to her. It was calling her. It had been waiting for them. Jake's hand shot out to grab her arm, his grip tight, desperate. No, we can't be part of this. We're not part of the land. We're human. But Maggie knew the truth. It wasn't a matter of being human, or not anymore. They were part of something far older, far darker, something that had existed long before the first human set foot on this earth. The land and the river had always been alive. They were the keepers of time, of memory, and now Maggie and the others had crossed the line. They had awakened it, and now they were its prisoners. The river surged forward, the waters rising higher and higher, swallowing the ground around them, pulling at the earth, the trees, the very sky. The guardian, once a shadowy figure, now fully emerged from the blackened water, its form towering and terrifying, made of twisting water, stone, and shadow. Its eyes glowed with an intensity that threatened to burn through everything. The hum of the river, the deep, resonating growl, filled
the air vibrating in Maggie's chest.
It was more than just sound. It was presence. It was the pulse of the earth itself, and it was coming for them. Maggie didn't want to look back. She didn't want to face the creature, the river, or the land, but she couldn't escape. The pull was too strong. The Guardian's gaze locked onto her, as if it knew her soul, knew her every thought. It was as if the river had always been watching her, waiting for this moment. And then she understood. They were the river's memory. The river carried the souls of the lost, the forgotten, and by crossing its boundary, they had become part of it, part of the endless cycle of time that had been repeating for centuries. Maggie felt a cold wave of understanding crash over her. The river wasn't just a place. It was a reality, a living, breathing entity that held time in its grasp, and it had been waiting for them to awaken it. And now their souls would be swept into it, to be lost to the land, to be remembered by the earth itself. We were always meant to come. The river's voice echoed in her mind, a haunting whisper that wrapped around her like a chain. You cannot escape. You have crossed the line, and now you belong to the river. Maggie's breath hitched in her throat as the full weight of the curse crashed down on her. She could feel the river's presence seeping into her veins, its cold, ancient power flooding her body. It wasn't just consuming her, it was becoming her. And she realized with a sickening clarity that they weren't just trapped here. They were now part of the land's endless cycle. Ellie's voice was a broken cry. "Maggie, no, we can't, don't!" But it was too late. The land shifted around them, and in that moment, the sky above seemed to tear open. Time itself wavered and broke. The forest, the river, the earth, they all rearranged. The pull of the river intensified, and the darkness around them deepened. The trees, the water, the very ground. They were alive, feeding on their souls, their memories, pulling them into the depths. And then, as if guided by an ancient rhythm, the water rose and engulfed them. Maggie felt herself sinking, her body swallowed by the cold, inky depths of the river. But even as she was pulled under, she knew she had crossed the line, and now she would be lost to time, a part of the river, a part of the land, a part of the forgotten cycle. The last thing she felt was the echo of the river's voice, the pull of the land. And as the water closed over her, the whispered words filled her mind. You will never leave. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The storm hit with the kind of fury only nature can summon, the kind that doesn't ask for your permission. Eddie had been driving for hours. The the road winding like a dark serpent through the ancient, untamed wilderness of Washington's Olympic National Forest. The endless drizzle had turned the asphalt slick and treacherous, the air thick with moisture, and the trees seemed to bow under the weight of the clouds, their gnarled branches twitching with an energy that felt unnatural. He squinted through the windshield, watching as the trees whipped violently in the wind, their tops disappearing into the black void above. His headlights cut through the rain, but it felt like the storm was swallowing the light, a relentless flood of water and wind that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The wipers were already working overtime, struggling to keep up with the downpour. The rhythmic slapping of rubber against glass was the only sound other than the occasional crack of thunder, which vibrated the truck's frame like an angry growl from the heavens. Eddie's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He had been driving for far too long without stopping, his body aching, his eyes burning with fatigue. The constant rhythm of the rain and the engine's hum had dulled his senses, and his mind began to wander to thoughts of home. The cabin he shared with his brother, now just an echo in the distance of his memory. The ache of losing his family, his brother, his parents, was still too fresh, even after all these years. His eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, the landscape outside a blur of grey. The road had begun to curve sharply, the trees on either side closing in, and it felt like the forest was trying to swallow him whole. He had driven this route before, but it had never felt so oppressive, so suffocating. The air was thick, with an unnatural stillness, and he could almost swear he could hear something whispering just out of reach of his hearing. Thunder rumbled above, and then the rain began to intensify even more, as though the sky itself had cracked open and was pouring everything it had onto the earth. Eddie couldn't keep going like this. He knew the forest well enough to know that getting caught on a curve in a storm like this would be disastrous. So he slowed the truck, turning on his hazard lights and pulling over to the side of the road. The truck's tires slid slightly, the rain turning the dirt beneath him into a soupy mire. He cursed softly, the vibrations of the truck settling into the uneasy quiet of the forest around him. He cracked open the window slightly, letting the cool air rush in, mingling with the smell of wet pine and earth. He needed a break, needed to stretch his legs. The storm was so thick now, so claustrophobic, that he couldn't see more than 20 feet in front of him. The forest seemed to be closing in, the trees looming like silent sentinels, watching him. The storm muffled everything, the usual sounds of nature drowned by the steady roar of the rain. No birds, no rustling of animals, just the wind, the rain, and the thunder. Eddie sat there for a moment, eyes closed, just listening to the rain hammer against the roof of the truck. His thoughts drifted, but they never stayed long. They were interrupted by a flash of lightning that lit up the world in a stark, jagged brilliance, and for a brief moment, he saw something that made his heart stutter. Standing just beyond the tree line, on the edge of the forest, was a figure. A man. The lightning blinked out as quickly as it had appeared, but Eddie's heart was already racing. He rubbed his eyes, convinced that it was just a trick of the light. The storm was playing games with him, the swirling rain and flashes of light warping his perception. But when the next crack of thunder rolled through, he looked again, and the man was still there. Eddie's breath hitched. The figure was still standing at the edge of the trees, completely motionless. He was soaked to the skin, drenched in the downpour, but his clothing, that was what caught Eddie's attention. It was old-fashioned. A long coat, dark and heavy, that reached down to his knees, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, making it impossible to tell anything about him. His clothes looked like something from another era, faded, tattered, out of place in a time like this. The man stood like a statue, unmoving, not reacting to the storm, as though he was made from the rain itself, part of the very landscape around him. Eddie blinked hard, trying to focus through the sheet of rain that obscured his view, but the figure remained perfectly still, no movement, not even a twitch. It was as if he was rooted to the earth, anchored in place by something otherworldly. The hairs on the back of Eddie's neck stood up, and a sudden chill washed over him. He knew the forest like the back of his hand, but there was something about this scene that felt wrong. This wasn't just a stranger caught in the rain. No, there was something far deeper and more unsettling about him. Another flash of lightning split the sky, and for a split second, Eddie saw the man take a step forward, but the sound of the rain didn't change. There was no splash of water, no rustling of leaves beneath his feet. The man simply moved, as if gliding above the ground, floating just inches from the earth. Eddie's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He couldn't look away. It was like a nightmare, but he was wide awake, trapped in it. Eddie's hand instinctively went to the horn, his fingers trembling as he pressed it down. The truck's horn blared into the storm, a sharp, shrill sound that should have been enough to startle the man, but there was no reaction, no flinch, no movement at all. The man's eyes, hidden under the brim of his hat, remained fixed. On Eddie, his body as still as stone. "Hey!" Eddie shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "Are you all right?" But there was no answer. The man didn't speak, didn't even seem to acknowledge him. His presence alone was enough to fill Eddie with a sense of dread. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The storm seemed to intensify again, the wind howling through the trees, but the man stood unmoving, untouched by the fury of nature surrounding him. Eddie's pulse hammered in his ears, the pit of his stomach growing colder with each passing second. He could feel it now, the weight of something ancient and forgotten pressing in on him from all sides, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The silence stretched on, stretching Eddie's nerves thin. He had to get out of there. He had to drive away, get back on the road, put miles between himself and this bizarre figure. But for some reason, he couldn't bring himself to start the truck. His body seemed frozen in place, his eyes glued to the figure standing there in the rain. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the man started to move. Slow, deliberate steps, gliding closer, like he was walking through the storm without feeling a drop of water. Eddie's breath caught in his throat. His foot hovered over the accelerator, but he didn't move. He couldn't. The figure took another step, and then another. Eddie's mind screamed at him to drive, to get away, but his body refused to obey, and just as quickly as it had begun, the storm seemed to ease. The rain lightened, the wind softened, and for a brief moment, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The trees stopped swaying, the thunder ceased, and the air settled into a strange, eerie calm. The figure was gone. Eddie blinked, confused, his heart still racing. He stared into the darkness, his mind trying to make sense of what he had just seen. There were no more footsteps, no sound of movement, nothing. The clearing was empty. He exhaled shakily, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Maybe he had imagined. It may be the storm had just played tricks on him. But then his eyes fell on the ground beside his truck, muddy footprints leading directly to his door. Eddie's breath caught in his throat. The truck, which had moments ago felt like a safe sanctuary from the storm, now felt like a trap. The muddy footprints seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy, as though they were still alive, still imprinting themselves into the earth with every second that passed. The marks were clear, large, deep impressions in the wet soil, each one too perfect, too deliberate. It was as though someone had carefully placed them there, step by step, even though he hadn't heard a single sound. The air around him grew colder, the faintest chill creeping into the truck's cabin. He could feel it, that unsettling feeling, deep in his gut, the kind that told him he wasn't alone, even though he hadn't heard a thing, even though there was no sign of the man. His gaze snapped back to the empty stretch of road in front of him, his mind racing. He scanned the tree line again, half expecting the man to emerge from the shadows, to suddenly step out from behind the trees and into the clearing. But there was nothing, just the darkness, the wet earth, and the occasional crack of thunder far off in the distance. But those footprints, those muddy prints leading to his truck, were impossible to ignore. They were real. He hadn't imagined them. Eddie's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the tension in his muscles, his body coiling in on itself, the instinctual pull to flee overpowering every other thought. He should drive. He should get back on the road and leave this place behind. Yet there was a strange heaviness pressing down on him, as though something were holding him in place. He couldn't move, couldn't take his eyes off the footprints. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to start the engine and never look back, but the grip of his fear kept him frozen. He looked again. The footprints were still there, leading up to the driver's side door of the truck. They seemed almost too deliberate, too precise, too clean, as if whoever had made them had walked through the rain without a single drop of water sticking. To them, their path untouched by the storm that raged around them. Eddie felt a creeping sensation crawl up his spine like a cold finger running down his back. The world outside had gone eerily quiet. The roar of the storm had died down to a low murmur, a soft drumming of rain on the roof of the truck, but the oppressive silence remained. It was as if the forest itself had gone still, waiting. The only sound left was the faint patter of the rain and his own breath, shaky and shallow. The storm had passed, but had it? Eddie's eyes darted around, searching for anything that could explain the sudden calm. Nothing. The trees stood still, their branches hanging like drooping arms, the rain now barely a whisper in the background. There was no sign of the man, no trace of his presence except for the footprints. A strange, uncomfortable silence had settled into the air, heavy and unnatural, and the truck had never felt smaller. Eddie's hands trembled as he wiped his brow, unsure of what to do next. He thought of calling someone, anyone, just to break the stillness, to find a human connection in the midst of the overwhelming isolation. He reached for his phone on the passenger seat, but then hesitated. The signal out here was non-existent, as always in the remote reaches of the forest. He had learned that the hard way on past trips. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something more than just the strange figure in the rain. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, and Eddie was the one in danger of suffocating. The feeling of being watched, the weight of unseen eyes upon him, crept into his consciousness. He looked out into the trees once more. Still nothing. His gaze flickered back to the footprints. A sudden noise broke the silence, a snap of a twig somewhere deep in the forest. Eddie's body went rigid. His heart skipped a beat, his chest tightening with a surge of panic. He waited, listening intently. There it was again, a faint rustling sound, the soft crack of underbrush shifting. His eyes darted toward the tree line, but no figure emerged from the shadows. The storm had taken away the natural sounds of the forest, leaving behind a haunting stillness punctuated only by the occasional gust of wind and the rhythmic drumming of the rain. The sound wasn't coming from behind the trees. It was closer, much closer. Eddie's pulse quickened. He could feel the tension in his chest, that familiar tightening that only came when something was terribly wrong. He slowly turned his head, scanning the clearing around the truck, half expecting to see someone or something step from the shadows. But again, there was nothing. And then, in the periphery of his vision, he saw it, a movement, just at the edge of the truck's hood, at the very edge of his vision. Something shifting in the dark, something wet, dripping and unnatural. He jerked his head toward it, but in that split second, it was gone. The feeling of cold dread intensified, creeping into his bones like a slow poison. Eddie's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the storm had muddled everything. His thoughts felt disconnected, like he was floating outside of himself, unable to ground his own reality. He pulled his eyes away from the trees and looked down at the footprints again. This time they seemed different. The fresh mud had dried slightly, but the footprints remained. Yet, there was something about them that felt more alive now, as though they were still being formed even as he looked at them. His stomach churned with nausea, the pit of fear deepening. Eddie's hand twitched, and he fought to steady himself, to push through the creeping dread. He needed to get moving. He needed to start the truck and get away from this place, from the strange figure, from the footprints that seemed to lead up to his very door. But something in him resisted, some quiet part of him that wanted to wait. Wait for what? He wasn't sure, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him, just beyond his reach. Another flash of lightning split the sky, its jagged brightness making the shadows of the trees seem even darker. Eddie's eyes shot up, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement, only the relentless rain, the beating of the storm. But then he noticed something strange. The rain wasn't falling the way it should. It wasn't just dripping down onto the earth, collecting in puddles around him. It was shifting, almost like it was hanging in the air, suspended. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Had he been driving too long? Was he losing his mind? But the strange sensation persisted. The rain, which had been a constant presence, now felt off, like it was somehow no longer obeying the laws of nature. He could almost feel the weight of each drop as it fell through the air, its trajectory strange, like something was interfering with its natural fall. His heart thudded loudly in his chest, and his eyes darted around again, the unsettling realization creeping into his mind. The air was still, save for the rain. The world felt wrong. Something was happening, and Eddie was at the center of it. Then, as if to confirm his worst fears, the temperature around him dropped sharply, the cold seeping into his very bones. His breath formed mist in front of him, thin tendrils curling upward as he exhaled. His fingers went numb against the steering wheel. Something was closing in. Something was moving through the forest, drawn to him like a predator stalking its prey. He turned to the window again, but this time he didn't look at the tree line. He looked at the footprints. They were there, but now they were closer. They seemed to have moved. And in the center of the nearest print, a single small detail caught his eye, a drop of water. But it wasn't rain. It was red, and it was still there. For a split second, Eddie thought his heart had stopped. It wasn't the rain, it was blood. The forest held its breath, and so did Eddie. The bloodstain was the last straw. Eddie's breath caught in his throat, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the small crimson drop nestled in the center of the muddy footprint. A shiver crawled down his spine, and every instinct screamed at him to get away. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. The storm had distorted his senses, twisted his perception, playing tricks on his mind. But that blood, it was unmistakable. Too dark, too vivid, too fresh. His pulse pounded in his ears as the blood slowly spread outward, staining the dirt like ink on parchment, its edges darkening like a wound that had been waiting to be discovered. The sight of it was suffocating, pressing in on him with the weight of something ancient and unyielding. The figure, the man, had to be behind it. There was no other explanation. Eddie's gaze shot back to the tree line, his eyes frantically scanning the shifting shadows, the rain falling in sheets so heavy that the world outside seemed like a blurry, muted painting. He couldn't see anything. No movement, no figure standing just beyond the trees. No sign that anything had changed since the last time he'd looked. But he felt it, a presence. He couldn't see it, but it was there. Just on the edge of his vision, on the edge of his awareness, something was watching him. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, his whole body on high alert. The silence between the moments of thunder felt pregnant with tension. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath. Suddenly the air shifted. It was subtle at first, a flicker of cold that rippled through the truck. Eddie's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, a shape, a blur. He spun in his seat, heart racing, mind screaming. His eyes locked onto the tree line, and there, at the edge of the clearing, standing between the trunks of two towering pines, was the figure, the man. He had come closer. No, he had appeared, as though he had materialized from thin air. One moment, the trees had been empty, and the next, he was there, standing as still as before, watching. His soaked coat clung to his frame, his broad-brimmed hat casting shadows over his face. The coat was so tattered now, its edges frayed, as though it had seen years, decades of exposure. His stance was unnervingly rigid, almost unnatural in the way he stood, as if rooted to the earth with a strength beyond human understanding. And yet, despite the violence of the storm, the rain didn't seem to touch him. Eddie's chest tightened, his breath shallow. His eyes flicked nervously. To the door. The footprints were still there, just as they had been, leading up to his truck, to the very place where he now sat paralyzed by fear. But what could he do? He couldn't drive. The storm had nearly drowned out all sound, leaving only the harsh rattle of his heartbeat and the relentless patter of rain against the truck. Every corner of his mind screamed for him to run, but his body betrayed him, frozen in place. The man moved, slowly, deliberate, unhurried. He glided closer, the distance between them shrinking with every beat of Eddie's pounding heart. His movements were unnervingly smooth, too fluid. No splashing, no shuffling footsteps. He simply drifted, through the rain, as though he were a ghost tethered to this place. Another crack of thunder rang out, rattling the truck's frame. Eddie flinched, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The rain turned into a deluge once again, thick and unrelenting, the world outside becoming a blur of silver grey. But the figure, impossibly, continued to approach. His clothes, once drenched, now shimmered unnaturally, as if the fabric of his coat was absorbing the very storm itself, refusing to be soaked. Eddie's mind reeled. What was this man? How was he moving like that? The figure should have been weighed down by the rain, by the slick, slippery ground beneath his feet. And yet, the man was somehow defying every rule Eddie knew. His presence, like the storm itself, seemed unnatural, like a force of nature, an intrusion into a world that had never known such things. Was this a dream? But the blood on the ground, the blood in the footprint, was too real to be a dream. This wasn't some fantasy. This was happening. The man was real, and he was coming closer. Eddie could feel his throat dry out, his voice swallowed by the storm. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat constricted, and all he could do was watch as the figure continued its eerie approach. The man paused just outside the range of the truck's headlights, his form still like a shadow, his face hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat. The forest around them was silent, unnervingly so. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, just the deafening roar of the rain, the sound of Eddie's breath quickening. For a moment there was nothing. The figure stood there, staring at Eddie, and it was as if time itself had stopped. No thunder, no rain, no sound, just the rhythmic thud of Eddie's heartbeat in his ears. Then in the next breath, the man tilted his head, just slightly, like he was studying Eddie. The sensation was intense, like a magnetic force pulling at his chest. Eddie felt his heart pound so loudly he could swear the man could hear it. A pulse of heat rushed through his body, only to be followed by a freezing cold. And then it happened. The air around Eddie shifted again, only this time it wasn't just cold. It was like a pressure had descended, something thick and suffocating, as if the world had suddenly become heavier. His vision blurred momentarily, and the man seemed to grow in his field of view. Taller, more imposing, a figure drawn from the very fabric of the storm itself. His outline flickered, as though he were phasing in and out of existence, shifting between the real world and something far darker, far older. Eddie's mind snapped into a frantic panic. The figure wasn't just here, it wasn't just standing. In the storm, it belonged to it. He was an extension of the dark sky, a thing woven from the rain, from the forest. This wasn't just some lost soul caught in a storm. This was something ancient, something tied to the land itself, to the very roots of the forest. Eddie's fingers trembled as he reached for the door handle, but before he could move, the figure took one final step forward. It was a movement so fluid, so unnatural, that Eddie's blood ran cold. The sound of his feet, if they even touched the ground, was drowned by the roar of the rain. But the figure was close now, too close. The moment their eyes would have met, Eddie felt a sharp jolt in his chest, like a wave of freezing cold crashing over him. His vision swam, his thoughts muddled, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The pressure in the air was suffocating, and then as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. The figure was gone. Eddie gasped for breath, his heart thundering in his ears. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his mind, but the world around him had changed. The storm was still raging, but the figure, the man, was no longer in sight. His eyes flicked around, searching, but there was no sign of movement. Nothing but the heavy weight of the rain, the low growl of distant thunder, but the feeling remained, that presence, that suffocating weight. He wasn't alone, not by a long shot. As Eddie's breath steadied, his eyes fell to the ground once again, to the footprints that had been leading up to his door. They were still there, still fresh, but now they were different. They were closer. No, the footprints had moved. One of them, the largest one, was right beneath his door. It had come inside. A cold shiver ran through Eddie, and for the first time, he heard something faint, barely audible over the storm, a whisper. But this time, it wasn't carried by the wind. It was clear. It was real. You shouldn't have stayed. Eddie's heart dropped to the pit of his stomach. The whisper, clear, cold, and filled with an unmistakable finality, echoed in his mind, reverberating through the tight space of the truck's cabin. The voice was not the wind. It was not a figment of his imagination. It was real. The figure, the man. He was here. Eddie's throat constricted as he looked at the door, then to the footprints that lay directly beneath it. His mind struggled to reconcile what his senses were telling him. He had clearly seen the man move, approach him, and now the footprints were closer. And yet there was no one outside. Nothing moved. There was no rustling in the trees, no sign of the figure standing just beyond the headlights. But the words, "You shouldn't have stayed," rang in his ears like a funeral bell, a dark omen that threatened to consume him. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a slight shift of shadows just beyond the cab, near the truck's side mirror. Eddie snapped his gaze toward it, his pulse quickening, but when he looked, there was nothing there. Only the trees swaying gently in the wind, the rain slapping against the glass like 1,000 tiny hands, begging him to listen. It was as though the world had shifted, and Eddie had fallen into the crack between realities. He could hear his breath now, shallow and labored, the faintest trembling in his chest, as if his very body knew something the rest of him could not comprehend. The figure was still out there. He could feel it, that looming, suffocating presence, and the storm felt even more suffocating now, pressing in on him from every direction. The words were still there in his mind, replaying again and again. You shouldn't have stayed. The truck felt smaller now, the air thicker, and Eddie couldn't shake the feeling that he was suffocating, trapped inside a cage of his own making. His eyes moved back to the footprints. They were wrong, too wrong. They weren't just footprints in the mud. They were something else, something deliberate. Eddie's hand went to the door handle, fingers trembling. His knuckles were pale, as if blood had rushed away from his limbs. Don't open the door, he thought. Don't get out there. But his mind was losing the battle to the rising panic, and his body was acting on its own, as if it were already too late to escape whatever had gripped him. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to look away from the door. He needed to think. He couldn't lose control. He had to stay calm. The thunder rumbled in the distance, a deep growl of nature's fury, but there was still no sign of the figure. The storm raged on in its fury, but the eerie silence in the truck had only deepened since the last whisper. Eddie glanced around the cabin, searching for something, anything, that could anchor him to reality, that could explain what was happening. The windshield was fogging up, beads of condensation collecting on the glass, distorting his view of the storm outside. His eyes flicked back to the door, and then he saw it, a reflection in the glass. For a split second, something shifted in the reflection, something that didn't match the real world outside. It was a subtle distortion, just a ripple in the surface of the truck's window, but it was there, impossible to ignore. The silhouette of a man, tall, cloaked in darkness, his wide-brimmed hat casting an ominous shadow over his face, standing just outside. His features were hidden, but Eddie could feel them. Those unseen eyes watching him with cold detachment. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, and for a long, terrible moment, he couldn't look away. The reflection was too clear now, too real, and in the span of that single heartbeat, Eddie knew that this was no mere hallucination. The figure was in the truck, standing right next to him, hidden by the storm, by the blinding rain, but undeniably there. But then, with a sharp crack of thunder that nearly split the sky, the reflection flickered. The figure blinked out of existence, swallowed by the darkness and rain. The cabin was empty once more. Eddie's pulse hammered in his throat, his hands trembling violently as he wiped his forehead with his sleeve, desperate to rid himself of the sheen of cold sweat. His mind reeled. He couldn't be imagining this. It was too real, the figure, the whispers, the sensation of being watched, all of it. It had been too long since the man had first appeared, but the dread only grew stronger, more suffocating with every second that passed. Was it possible that he had fallen into a nightmare? Could he have driven too long, lost himself in the forest, only to have his mind crack under the strain? A shiver ran down his spine, and this time, it wasn't from the cold. The truck's headlights suddenly flickered, a stutter of light followed by an eerie hum, and then the entire vehicle went dark. The only light now was the weak, distant glow from the storm overhead, lightning flashing in the distance. Eddie's heart skipped a beat. He hit the dashboard, but there was no sound of the engine turning over. No response. The truck had shut down. The world outside the truck had gone eerily quiet. The rain still fell in a steady, unyielding rhythm, but there was no sound of the wind, no creaking of branches, only the distant rumble of thunder in the far-off sky. It was as if the storm had suddenly forgotten how to rage. He reached for the door handle once more, but this time, something was different. There was a pressure on the air, a weight that pressed down on his chest, as though the very atmosphere had thickened. He could almost hear the faintest whispering again, too faint, too close. A cold breath seemed to brush across his neck, sending a chill straight to his bones. Then, it happened again. The headlights flickered back on, the truck's engine humming softly as if nothing had happened. Eddie froze. The sudden change, so sudden, so unnatural, sent a jolt of fear through him. He glanced nervously outside, but the figure had not reappeared. Not yet, but he could feel it. The presence, the watching. It had only grown stronger. He glanced down at his feet, then back to the door. A new set of footprints. Not from the storm. These footprints, these steps, were different. Fresh, but smaller. Almost childlike in their appearance. They led directly up to his door. The whisper, now louder, clearer, sounded again in his mind. "You shouldn't have stayed." He didn't want to turn around. He didn't want to look. But he had no choice. Slowly, inch by inch, his gaze lifted. Standing directly behind him, in the dim glow of the headlights, was the man. And this time, he was smiling. Not with a face, not with lips, but with the eyes. Eddie's breath caught. The eyes, they weren't just eyes. They were holes, black, empty voids that seemed to consume the very light around them. And the smile, it wasn't a smile at all. It was a warning. The man's hand rose slowly, a gesture so fluid, so deliberate, that Eddie couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very fabric of reality was slipping away. He opened his mouth. Only this time, the words that followed weren't a whisper. They were a command. "Open the door." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, settling around Eddie's mind, choking him. "Open the door." The voice was low, cold, and calm. Too calm. There was no anger in it, no urgency, only a dreadful certainty. The figure behind him stood, motionless, its hand suspended in the air, pointing directly at the door. The man's eyes, those endless, empty voids, stared directly into Eddie's soul, as if peeling away the very layers of his being, leaving only the raw core of his fear exposed. Eddie's heart hammered in his chest, louder than the storm, louder than the rumbling thunder. His hands shook violently, the cold sweat on his palms making it almost impossible to grip the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to move, to get out of this place. But his body remained frozen, locked in place by something far stronger than his will. It was as if the figure was weaving an invisible net around him, tightening with each passing second. The man, still standing just behind him, made no sound. He didn't move except for his hand, which remained poised, outstretched, pointing to the door with unnerving precision. There was no mistaking the message. It was a command, a demand. "Open the door." Eddie's breath quickened, his chest tightening, with the weight of the storm, the weight of the figure behind him. His mind swam with thoughts, wild, irrational thoughts, trying to grasp at anything that could break the hold the figure had on him. He thought of his family, his brother, the cabin that seemed so far away now. He thought of the life that seemed so distant, so unreachable, as if he had been transported to some other world where the rules no longer applied. And then, against all reason, against every impulse to not obey, Eddie's hand moved, slowly, trembling, reluctant, toward the door handle. His fingers brushed the cold metal and the chills seeped into his bones, sending a jolt of panic through his body. He pulled his hand away quickly, as if the handle had burned him. But the compulsion to open the door remained, like a weight pressing down on him from all sides. The air in the cabin felt suffocating now, as though the storm outside had somehow entered the truck, folding in on itself. The figure's hand remained in place, and Eddie could feel the pull of his gaze, even though he hadn't turned to face him. It was as if he could see the man with his mind alone. Those eyes, those hollow, black eyes, stared right through him, and in that moment, Eddie understood something deeply unsettling. The man wasn't simply trying to get him to open the door, no. The man was waiting for it, anticipating it. He wasn't just a part of the storm or the forest. He was tied to it, woven into the fabric of the night itself. Another flicker of lightning flashed outside, lighting up the clearing in a sudden, blinding brilliance. In that fleeting moment, Eddie saw it, just beyond the door, a glimpse of the figure's silhouette. The man was right there, standing in the rain, his dark form blending with the shadows of the trees. The world seemed to hold its breath. Eddie's hand hovered over the door handle again. His mind screamed for him to stop, but his body, his trembling, terrified body, was moving of its own accord. The figure wasn't just waiting. He was pulling him in, pulling him closer with a gravity he couldn't understand. It was as if the door was the only thing standing between him and whatever the figure wanted. And if he didn't open it, if he didn't comply, it would only escalate. The storm outside seemed to intensify in that moment, the wind howling, the rain battering the truck with a vengeance, but the figure remained still. He had not moved an inch. Eddie's fingers curled around the handle again. His hand was shaking so badly that he could barely hold it. But there was something about the air, something about the silence now hanging around him, that pushed him forward. The command echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. Open the door, open the door. And then, the moment his fingers gripped the handle fully, the truck's headlights flickered and everything went dark. For a second, Eddie could only hear the pounding of his own heart in the void of darkness. The storm outside had swallowed the world once again, the wind howling louder than before, the rain falling in deafening sheets. But in the truck, there was a suffocating silence. The headlights had gone out completely. He was blind, encased in nothing but the suffocating blackness of the storm. His breath hitched in the pitch dark. His thoughts spun in wild circles. He couldn't see a thing. The only sound in the truck now was the gentle, rhythmic thud of the rain against the metal. His hands were still trembling, still hovering over the handle. He could hear his own breath, ragged and shallow, a physical manifestation of the fear closing in around him. What was happening? Where was the man? He twisted the door handle again, and this time it turned. The door creaked open, slowly, resisting, as if the truck itself were unwilling to let him open it. The storm outside surged in with a cold, gusting wind, and Eddie felt a chill course through him, as if the very air had been sucked out of the truck. The door opened wider, and a strange, unnatural pressure filled the space. Something cold, something dark, pushing against him. He couldn't see, couldn't hear, but he knew. He knew the figure was right outside. It was like some invisible force was pulling at him, urging him to step out into the blackness, to go into the storm, into the waiting presence. Then, just as his foot hovered near the truck's step, as if drawn by an invisible string, there was a flash of light, a single, searing bolt of lightning streaking across the sky. In that instant, Eddie saw him. The man, standing just outside the door, his figure framed by the lightning, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He wasn't standing still anymore. He was moving toward Eddie, no longer floating, no longer gliding. He was walking, but he wasn't walking on the ground. He was hovering, his feet inches above the ground, leaving no trace in the mud. His long coat trailing behind him like a dark, flowing shadow. In the blinding flash of the lightning, Eddie saw the man's hand stretch out toward him, the fingers long and impossibly thin, pale as death. The hand reached toward him, the fingers curling, as if beckoning him into the storm. Eddie's breath froze in his throat, and then, just like that, the lightning faded. The man was gone. The door slammed shut with a force so strong that the entire truck shook. The lights flickered back on, the engine roaring to life. Eddie blinked in confusion, disoriented, his eyes darting around the cabin. The truck was vibrating. Beneath him, the hum of the engine filling his ears. The storm outside had not lessened, but the figure had disappeared. The silence was suffocating. Eddie's heart was still pounding in his chest, his head spinning with the sudden return of sound and light. But something was wrong, something still felt off. His gaze fell once more to the footprints, and for the first time, Eddie realized the terrifying truth. The footprints were still there, leading into the truck, but there was no sign of the figure, no sign of anything that had caused the storm to begin with. The truck was empty, yet the mud, deep, thick, and unmistakably fresh, streaked from the open door and into the cabin, just beneath his seat. The presence remained, and Eddie knew then that the figure was still with him, still waiting. The storm outside had returned to its frenzied rhythm, the rain falling in thick, blinding sheets, the thunder growling in the distance like some forgotten beast. But inside the truck, the world had shifted into an oppressive quiet that felt like a weight pressing down on Eddie's chest. The sound of the rain, the wind, the distant crashes of lightning, all of it seemed muffled, as though the very air around him had thickened, solidified. It was as if he were encased in some kind of invisible bubble, the world outside a distant and hostile landscape he no longer had access to. Eddie's breath came in short, shallow gasps. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his fingers slick with cold sweat, his palms clammy against the leather. He felt the thrum of the truck's engine beneath him, but it seemed so far away, so distant from the suffocating, paralyzing silence that had consumed him. The air felt heavy, as if it were filled with something unspoken, something unnatural, pressing down on him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. His gaze flickered nervously to the rearview mirror, but there was nothing, just darkness. The tall footprints. The footprints were still there. They had not faded. They had not disappeared. The muddy imprints, large and deep, led directly from the truck's door to the seat next to him. His eyes were drawn to them, fixed on the evidence that someone had entered the truck while he had been blinded by the storm. The world outside had shifted, changed, and someone had come inside with him. Eddie's stomach twisted painfully as he realized the true horror of it. He wasn't alone. The figure was no longer a distant silhouette standing just beyond the trees. No, the figure had moved with him, had followed him, closing the distance, infiltrating the truck in a way that defied all sense of logic and reason. The truck's cabin, which had once felt like a refuge from the storm, now felt like a tomb. The air was thick, suffocating. The dampness of the storm seemed to have seeped into the very walls of the truck, into the seats, the floors, into his skin. Eddie's pulse hammered in his throat, his thoughts running wild in a desperate bid to make sense of the impossible. He tried to tell himself that it was just the stress of the storm, just the exhaustion of being on the road for so long. But deep down, he knew the truth. The truth was far worse. The presence was still here. He could feel it now, pressing in from all sides. It wasn't something he could see or touch, but it was there, in the back of his mind, just beyond his reach, like an echo of a forgotten memory or a dream that was slipping through his fingers. But it wasn't a dream. He was wide awake. The world was as real as ever, yet the rules of reality itself had twisted. The rain pounded relentlessly outside, but inside the truck, it was as if the world had been paused, everything waiting, suspended in time. Eddie glanced at the passenger seat. The footprints, those muddy, dripping imprints, stretched across the seat and disappeared under the dash. They weren't just on the floor anymore. They had moved. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The figure hadn't just approached him from outside. It had entered the truck. It had walked in with him. His hand trembled violently as he reached for the door handle again. But the moment his fingers brushed the cold metal, he stopped. The truck had become a prison, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the suffocating grip of fear. The door was open, but the storm outside felt like a threat now. The very world beyond the truck was now tainted. It was no longer a place of refuge. It was a place of containment. Eddie's breath quickened, and he felt his chest tighten with the rising wave of panic. His eyes flickered once more to the rearview mirror, but he couldn't bring himself to look directly. The mirror was too small, too narrow. It was a trap. Every glance, every fleeting reflection reminded him that something was there. Out there, but not out there. The figure's presence clung to him, suffocating him. He knew it. He could feel it watching him, like a weight pressing down on his chest, pressing the air from his lungs. A sudden noise, something small, sounded from the corner of the truck just beyond his line of sight. Eddie froze. His heart skipped a beat. It was the kind of noise that would be easy to ignore. A rustle, a soft scrape, easily mistaken for the shifting of the storm or the trees outside groaning in the wind. But it wasn't. He knew it wasn't. This sound, this noise, was deliberate. Slowly, slowly, Eddie turned his head. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see. But he had to. He had no choice. The corner of the passenger seat. There was movement. For a split second, he thought, it was just the shadows, just the shifting of light as the storm raged outside. But then he saw it, the coat. A dark, long coat, soaked to the bone, hanging loosely from the figure, the fabric shifting as though it were breathing, moving of its own accord. Eddie's breath hitched in his throat, his chest tightening with a surge of cold panic. The coat's long, flowing fabric stretched over the seat, pooling onto the floor, and there, beneath the coat, he saw something else. A hand, a thin, pale hand, long fingers curling upward, moving slowly, deliberately. The hand was reaching for the steering wheel. Eddie's blood ran cold, his mouth going dry. His eyes widened, the world shrinking around him as the realization sank in. The hand was moving toward him, toward the wheel, toward him. No, no, no. The hand hovered just above the wheel, and then slowly, deliberately, it curled around the leather. The fingers tightened, the knuckles white, and with one sharp, deliberate motion, the hand jerked the wheel. Eddie's breath stopped. The truck lurched. He could feel the motion before he saw it, a sickening twist of the wheel. The truck's tires slid on the slick asphalt, the entire vehicle veering sharply to the right. The steering wheel jerked, as though pulled by a force beyond Eddie's control. His hands were glued to his sides, his body unwilling to respond. The truck swerved violently. The world outside the truck began to blur. Eddie's stomach churned. The storm was still relentless, but it felt more distant now, like a dream. The trees outside bent and swayed, their forms distorted, stretched like shadows under the weight of the wind. But the figure was still there. Eddie's eyes flickered to the passenger seat again, where the hand was still wrapped around the wheel. It wasn't his hand. It was something else. Thin, elongated, pale as though it didn't belong. The fingers stretched unnaturally long, the skin a sickly pale white, like something that had been buried in the earth for far too long. The wheel turned again, the truck veering further off course, the headlights casting erratic beams of light that splashed wildly across the trees. But the figure in the passenger seat didn't move. Its presence was as solid as the storm itself, as unyielding as the earth beneath the tires. A soft whisper slipped through the air again, just beneath the sound of the storm. The voice was low and guttural, almost a sigh. "You shouldn't have stayed." And then, in the instant that followed, the truck's tires lost their grip. Everything went black. The truck swerved violently, its tires skidding on the slick road, sending it careening across the uneven terrain. Eddie's stomach lurched with a feeling of weightlessness, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed to dissolve into a blur of shadow and rain. His body slammed against the side of the door as the truck jolted, its tires spinning helplessly against the wet asphalt. Every muscle in Eddie's body screamed for him to act, to correct the wheel, to regain control. But it was as if the very air around him had thickened, slowing his movements, rendering him powerless. His vision blurred. The world tilted sideways as the truck began to fishtail, the engine roaring in protest, its tires screeching against the asphalt. The headlights sliced through the storm, illuminating only the chaos of the storm's wrath and the dark, thick forest that surrounded him. The truck's body groaned, its metal frame protesting the violent motions, the entire vehicle sliding toward the edge of the road. His mind screamed in panic. He was going to crash. But even then, even as the truck careened towards certain disaster, Eddie felt a strange, sickening stillness take hold of him. He could see it now, just beyond the reach of the headlights, a figure standing motionless at the edge of the road in the trees, watching. That same man, the one with the black, empty eyes. His coat hung limply around him, the shadows swallowing up his form, but the presence was undeniable. He was still there, like a ghost, silent, unmoving, detached from the violent storm, as though he were beyond it all, beyond time itself. And that face, those black, hollow eyes, staring into Eddie's soul, hadn't moved an inch. Not once. Not even when the truck veered toward him. The headlights snapped, flickering once again, the engine's roar drowned by the sudden silence that seemed to fill the truck's cabin. The world outside remained a blur of darkness and rain, but inside the truck, a dreadful stillness fell. Eddie's heart pounded violently in his chest, but his body, his frozen, trembling body, remained completely still. It was as if time itself had stopped. He could feel the truck's slide, the cold grip of fear tightening around his throat, but there was no sound. No movement, only the oppressive, crushing silence of the forest. Then, with a sickening thud, the truck hit something soft but solid, before jerking to a complete halt. Eddie's body slammed forward, the seatbelt digging into his chest. The breath knocked from his lungs. His hands shot out instinctively, gripping the steering wheel as though trying to hold on to the last shred of control. His head throbbed, his vision swirling as he fought to regain his bearings. The world around him seemed to tilt, then right itself in slow motion, the truck's engine dying down to a sputter. The storm continued, but the truck had stopped. The headlights were still on. The wipers still swiped relentlessly across the windshield. But now, the only sound in the truck was the heavy, ragged rhythm of Eddie's breath. His eyes were locked on the front window, on the dark stretch of forest that loomed in front of him. It felt as though the night itself had gathered around him, closing in, suffocating him with its presence. The trees, dark, gnarled, twisted, stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind, their shadows stretching toward the truck like cold, outstretched hands. But the figure was gone. The man, the presence, was no longer in sight. Eddie's heartbeat pounded in his ears, and he could hear the faint ringing in his head. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. The truck was dead. The rain fell in sheets, hammering against the windshield as the storm continued its wild, unrelenting fury. The road in front of him had become a blur of black and grey, the headlights only illuminating the immediate world around him, the narrow stretch of road that seemed to disappear into the oppressive darkness beyond. He reached for the door, his hand shaking so violently that he could barely grip the handle. The feeling of the storm's power was suffocating, a pressing weight that made it almost impossible to breathe. The door creaked open, but the cold wind rushed in immediately, a sharp bite of ice that snapped at his skin, cutting through him like 1,000 needles. The rain poured in, drenching him in an instant. But it wasn't just the rain that struck him, it was the cold, the unnatural cold, colder than anything he had ever felt before, colder than the storm itself. Eddie stumbled out of the truck, the world tilting around him, the ground beneath his feet slick and treacherous. He barely caught himself, his legs shaking beneath him as he pushed himself upright. The forest loomed around him, dark and silent. And for a moment he wondered if he had truly left the truck behind, or if it, too, was just another illusion in this warped, nightmarish place. The storm roared in his ears as he stumbled back, turning to face the truck. His only refuge in this, madness. But before he could move, he felt it again, that presence. It was a weight in the air, a suffocating pressure that squeezed the breath from his chest, that made his legs go weak beneath him. He wasn't alone. He wasn't alone. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Eddie turned sharply, his eyes darting through the rain, but he saw nothing. No figure, no movement. Just the endless, swirling storm and the dark, oppressive forest around him. Yet the air around him felt thick, as if the forest had drawn a circle around him, trapping him in place. His hands trembled and his legs wobbled as he took a step back, trying to distance himself from the pressure that pressed in on him. His throat felt tight, the world constricting with each breath he took. He could feel it, something just beyond his reach, just at the edge of his awareness. And then, in the deafening silence that followed, he heard it. The faintest rustle, just a shift in the leaves, a disturbance in the air, so quiet, so faint, that he might have missed it if he hadn't been listening so intently. Eddie's heart skipped a beat. He turned, and there, standing just beyond the reach of the headlights, was the man, the figure, the one who had been haunting him, watching him, ever since the storm had first taken hold. He was standing in the rain, as still and silent as before. His coat hung like a dark shadow around him, his face still obscured by the wide brim of his hat. But now the air around him was heavier, denser, more suffocating. The figure didn't move, he didn't speak, but his presence was like a weight that pressed down on Eddie's chest, suffocating him, drowning him in a silence so thick it felt like the world itself was closing in. Eddie's breath came in shallow gasps. His limbs were trembling, his chest tight with fear, but he couldn't look away. His body was frozen. The world had stopped. The figure didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes, those cold, black eyes, were enough. They stared into Eddie's soul, seeing everything. And then finally the man moved. He stepped forward just one step, but it was enough. Enough to send a jolt of terror through Eddie's body, enough to shatter the stillness of the moment. And just as suddenly as it had begun, the figure vanished. The storm raged on, the rain continuing to beat down. But the man was gone. The forest was empty once more, but the presence, it lingered, and Eddie knew he was not alone, not anymore. Eddie's body trembled uncontrollably, his pulse hammering in his throat as he stood alone in the storm. The rain was relentless, slashing against his skin like needles. But it was the absence of sound that unnerved him the most. The world outside felt wrong, unnaturally quiet despite the storm's fury. The only noise that filled his ears was the pounding of the rain against his skin, and even that seemed muffled, distant, as though the storm were happening on the other side of a wall, separated from him by some invisible force. His feet felt glued to the ground, unable to move, and his breath came in ragged, desperate gasps as he scanned the empty stretch of road. The figure, the man, was gone, vanished without a trace, swallowed by the storm as if he had never been there at all. And yet the presence remained. It lingered in the air, a thick, oppressive feeling that seemed to cling to Eddie's skin, to seep into his very bones. His heart raced, each beat thundering in his ears as his mind struggled to make sense of the chaos around him. What was happening? He turned back toward the truck. The headlights illuminated the road, the rain running in rivers down the windshield. But nothing was different. No sign of the man. No sign of movement. No sign of movement. The truck was just sitting there, silent, lifeless, as if it too had become part of the storm's endless void. The trees loomed around him, twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The forest seemed to have swallowed everything, trapping him in its depths, wrapping its dark fingers around his chest, squeezing the air from his lungs. It wasn't just the storm that terrified him now. It was the forest, the woods that felt like they were watching him, waiting for him to slip up, to make the wrong move. Eddie's breath shuddered as he stumbled backward, his feet slipping in the wet mud, his eyes locked on the road behind him. He had to get back in the truck. He had to find a way out of this place, and yet, the longer he stood in the open, the more he felt that suffocating weight closing in on him. The feeling of being watched, he could feel it. Those invisible eyes on him pressing into the back of his skull, digging into his mind with invisible fingers. He wasn't alone. The figure, the man, was still out there somewhere. And whatever it was that haunted him, whatever dark force had been following him since the moment he pulled off the road, was still lurking just out of sight. Move, move, move! Eddie's legs shook beneath him, his muscles straining as his body finally obeyed, his feet stumbling back toward the truck. He fumbled for the door handle, his fingers slick with sweat, the cold rain making everything more difficult. With a low groan of protest, the truck door creaked open, and Eddie collapsed back into the seat, slamming the door shut behind him as if the storm itself might come rushing in. The truck's engine hummed softly, a weak mechanical sound that felt out of place in the chaos outside. He didn't care. The moment the door slammed shut, the world outside seemed to pause. The pressure in the air lifted just slightly. The storm didn't feel as suffocating as it had moments before. Eddie sucked in a breath, still trembling, but it didn't help. His heart was still racing, and the deep, gnawing feeling of dread refused to leave him. He slammed his hands against the dashboard in frustration, his palms wet against the smooth surface. His mind felt like it was buzzing, like an electric current, running through him, his thoughts darting around, incoherent, trying to find something, anything that made sense. But there was no clarity. Only the storm, only the oppressive silence that pressed in on him from all sides, and then a sound. At first it was so faint that Eddie wasn't sure he had heard it at all. A rustling, a crackling, something, someone, moving, just outside the truck. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. His hands gripped the steering wheel, the cold metal biting into his skin. He wasn't imagining it. The sound was real. Something, or someone, was out there, in the storm. He listened intently, his ears straining, trying to hear anything over the cacophony of the rain. The rustling came again, closer this time. Soft, deliberate. The sound of something brushing against the side of the truck. A whisper of fabric. The shifting of feet in the mud. Whatever it was far too close for comfort. And the worst part, the part that set Eddie's pulse racing and his stomach churning, was that it was silent. There was no splash, no squelch of mud or water. No footsteps in the rain, only the soft, dry rustle, as though whatever was moving out there was floating just above the ground. A cold, creeping dread slithered up Eddie's spine. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as he pressed his forehead against the glass, staring into the storm, unable to tear his eyes away from the thick veil of rain. There was no movement outside, nothing visible. But the rustling continued, growing louder, shifting, circling the truck like a predator stalking its prey. His mind screamed for him to start the truck, to drive, to get away. But his body wouldn't move. His limbs were frozen, trapped in that suffocating air of silence that had descended on the truck. All he could do was sit there, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. And then it happened, a faint tap, a single, soft tap against the passenger side window. Eddie's breath caught in his throat. The tap was so quiet, so subtle, that for a moment He thought it might have been the wind, or just a trick of the storm. But no, it was real. It was there. He dared not look. His eyes stayed locked on the windshield, the blurred, rain-smeared glass offering him only a distorted view of the world outside. His heart hammered in his chest, his throat tight, as he forced himself to remain still. He couldn't look. He couldn't see it. But the tap came again. This time, louder, clearer. A deliberate sound, a command that resonated deep inside his chest. It was unmistakable now. Someone, or something, was tapping on the window. Eddie's body tensed, every muscle screaming at him to look, to face whatever this was. But a part of him, something primal, something deep within his bones, begged him to stay still, to ignore it, to pretend that whatever was out there wasn't real. But it was real. The tapping grew faster, more urgent. It wasn't just one tap anymore. It was a rapid succession, like the tapping of fingers, each one pressing against the glass with a force that rattled the window. The sound reverberated through the truck, echoing in the silence, breaking through the fog of dread that had enveloped Eddie. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The tapping ceased. The silence that followed was deafening. Eddie's heart pounded in his chest, and his breathing was shallow, ragged. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles ached. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He could only wait. The world outside was dark, empty, but he wasn't alone. The presence had never left. And whatever was out there, whatever had just tapped on his window, was waiting, watching. And Eddie knew in that moment with sickening certainty he would never be free of this, not as long as he was here, not as long as the storm still raged. The stillness inside the truck was unbearable. Eddie's chest rose and fell with every shallow breath he took, his mind spinning in frantic circles. The rain continued to hammer against the windshield, the soft rhythm of it almost mocking the thick, palpable silence that had settled inside the truck. But it wasn't just the silence that was suffocating him. It was the feeling of being watched, that overwhelming presence that had been dogging him since he first pulled off the road. He couldn't escape it. No matter how much he tried to push it from his mind, it lingered, an unshakable weight pressing against his chest, making it hard to breathe, to think. His hand still gripped the steering wheel, but the tension in his fingers was almost painful. He didn't know what to do. The truck was dead. The engine had stopped, and there was no sign of help anywhere. No way out. No escape. The tap on the window had stopped. The presence had gone silent too. But the absence of sound only made the dread in his chest grow stronger. He had no idea how much time had passed since the tapping had ceased, but it felt like hours. He couldn't bring himself to look outside. Every time his gaze strayed toward the passenger side window, he imagined that he would see those dark, hollow eyes staring back at him. Those eyes that seemed to look straight into his soul. But there was something else now, something more tangible, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The footprints that had started outside the truck, leading up to the door, and had only grown closer. They hadn't faded, hadn't disappeared, and as Eddie's gaze flickered toward the floor, he saw them again, those muddy prints trailing across the truck's interior. The tracks had been left by the figure, the man. There was no other explanation. But what was terrifying now was that the footprints didn't make sense. They were too deliberate, too purposeful, as if whoever, whatever, had created them had been moving with a singular goal in mind. Eddie's eyes moved over them, scanning the path they followed. The prints had started near the passenger side, then moved in a winding trail to the driver's seat, stopping just a few inches from where he sat. But now, they were different. They weren't just footprints anymore. There was something new, a faint, Wet streak of mud, thin, almost invisible at first glance, had appeared beside the prints. It was a slanted trail, as if something had been dragged. The stain stretched along the floor, trailing across the rubber mats and into the space beneath the seat. Eddie's pulse quickened as his eyes followed the path. It didn't make sense. There was no way the storm had caused it. The rain was too heavy, too relentless. The dirt from the footprints had been fresh, soft, but this was something else. Eddie's stomach twisted as his gaze fell to the seat next to him. The figure had been there. He knew it. He could still feel it, the strange weight that had been pressing down on the seat. But now it looked as if the seat itself had been disturbed. The fabric was damp. The shape of someone, something, had clearly pressed into it, leaving an indent, a subtle impression, but unmistakable. Eddie's hand clenched around the seatbelt, his body frozen, his mind screaming at him to move. He was trapped. He had to get out of here. There had to be a way to escape. He couldn't stay in this truck. But something inside, him, the part of him that had been awake, alert and terrified since the moment he had stopped, told him that he was already too late. The presence had entered with him. It had followed him in. It had marked him. The seatbelt dug into his chest, but he couldn't make himself unbuckle it. His fingers fumbled in the dark, trying to release it, but the act seemed too much, too slow. Each moment felt like an eternity. He leaned forward, pushing his face closer to the window, trying to peer through the rain to see if there was something, someone standing out there. But the storm was too thick, the windshield too blurry with water. He couldn't make out anything past the glass. All he could see were those streaks. The rain splattered across the surface, blurring everything beyond it. The pressure in the air was growing again, thickening, suffocating. It was as though the storm had intensified, not just outside, but inside too. The walls of the truck felt smaller now, as if the world itself was closing in, tightening around him. The silence that had been so deafening was now filled with something else, a hum, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to crawl beneath his skin, making his blood run cold. Eddie's head snapped to the rearview mirror. His breath caught. The back seat was no longer empty. In the dim light of the truck's cabin, something moved. At first, it was subtle, a shift, a rustle of fabric. But then, there it was again, a figure indistinct but undeniable sitting in the back seat, hunched low. The coat, the wide-brimmed hat, just visible through the mirror. Eddie's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard the door open. He hadn't seen anyone approach the truck. And yet, there it was, the figure in the back seat. He hadn't seen it enter. He hadn't heard the door creak open. The truck was locked. The storm had been too fierce. The windows rolled up. But there it was. Eddie's breath caught in his throat. His fingers were shaking violently now. His whole body trembled as he slowly, with dread-filled hesitation, turned to look at the figure. It didn't move. It was just sitting there, the shape in the back seat growing clearer as Eddie's eyes adjusted to the darkness. The coat was soaked, but it hung in unnerving stillness. The wide-brimmed hat, still obscuring the face, cast deep shadows across the figure's features. It was like looking at a statue, motionless, silent. But the most unsettling part was that Eddie couldn't see where the figure ended. There was no clear edge to the body. The longer he stared, the more it seemed as though the shape was simply blending with the shadows, as if it was made from the very dark fabric of the night, stitched together by the storm. The humming sound grew louder, and then, without warning, the figure shifted. Not in a way that made any sense. It wasn't the movement of a person. It was like something unnatural had twisted and reformed itself. It slid across the seat, the coat shifting unnervingly, as though it were a fabric held together by threads of mist and rain. The shape did not stand, did not move in any natural way. It flowed. Eddie couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. He couldn't escape. The figure in the back seat, once static, was now so close to him that Eddie could feel its presence, like a heavy weight, pressing against his chest. His eyes locked on it, unable to look away, unable to tear his gaze from the impossible shape that was neither man nor shadow. It was like a thing of the storm itself, a creature born from the darkness that had followed him, one that was far beyond his understanding. And as it moved toward him, so slowly, so deliberately, Eddie heard the voice again. "You shouldn't have stayed." This time, the words were clearer, and as they echoed through the cabin, they seemed to reverberate with a deep, unnatural force. It was as if the words themselves were part of the storm, part of the earth beneath him, part of something that had been waiting for him. The figure was inches away now, its cold presence filling the truck, and Eddie could feel it, feel the shift in the air, the suffocating weight of it. He had no more time. There was no way out. And then the truck's lights flickered once, twice, before plunging the cabin into darkness. The storm outside howled. The figure was here. The truck was plunged into total darkness. The faint glow from the headlights now nothing more than a distant memory, swallowed whole by the oppressive storm outside. Eddie's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the world felt suspended. The weight of the silence in the truck was deafening, broken only by the frantic pounding of his heart in his chest. The figure, whatever it was right there, so close that Eddie could almost feel its cold, damp presence pressing against him, despite the distance between them. His hands were frozen to the steering wheel, his fingers numb from fear, though. He couldn't feel anything other than the suffocating chill creeping into his bones. The air around him felt wrong, too cold. The storm outside had been unrelenting, but now it was as though the storm itself had entered the truck. It was no longer just the wind or the rain that chilled him to the core. It was something else, something far colder, something unnatural. The Chihuahua figure in the back seat, still just a dark shape, its features obscured in the blackness, had moved. Eddie could feel it, could sense the shift in the air as it inched closer. His mind screamed for him to act, to do something, but his body remained frozen, paralyzed by the weight of the moment. The truck's interior felt impossibly small, the air thickening with every breath he took. It was as if the very fabric of the truck had become part of the nightmare, a cage closing around him. He didn't dare move his gaze, but he could feel the cold, the overwhelming pressure drawing closer. The figure was inches away now, so close. He could feel its presence on the edge of his perception, like a shadow pressing against his skin, seeping through every pore. And then, from the darkness, came the sound. A soft scraping. A dragging, almost imperceptible noise that made the hairs on the back of Eddie's neck stand straight. It was the sound of something, someone, moving slowly, deliberately toward him. The noise was subtle at first, as if the figure was dragging, itself inch by agonizing inch, but it grew louder, more distinct, until Eddie could hear it clearly, something scraping across the seat. It was like the sound of wet fabric dragging across the leather, each movement slow and measured. A deep, cold shiver racked Eddie's body, his chest tightening as the scraping sound drew closer, and he couldn't help but imagine, no, feel, the weight of it beside him. He could see it now in his mind, the figure's form moving through the shadows, its coat fluttering slightly, like an unnatural wind was stirring it. It was not human. It could not be. No human could move like that. No person could shift in and out of the storm like it did, gliding through the air as if gravity had no hold on it. Eddie wanted to scream, wanted to shout for help, to do anything, to break the tension, but the words refused to leave his throat. His mouth felt dry, parched, as if the very air in the truck was stealing his breath. His chest felt constricted, his heart thudding against his ribs in desperate, erratic beats. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, to escape, but his legs wouldn't move. His arms wouldn't budge from the steering wheel. He was trapped, held in place by something far more powerful than his own fear. And then, a whisper. It wasn't a voice from outside the truck. It didn't come from the storm, or from the figure standing in the back seat. The whisper came from within Eddie's own mind, a cold breath like ice on the back of his neck, slipping through his thoughts, chilling him to the bone. "You shouldn't have stayed." It was the same voice, the same chilling whisper that had echoed through his head before, but now it was so much closer, so much more intimate. It was as if the words had slipped into his mind, infecting him, burrowing deep within, twisting his thoughts, and every time he heard them they grew more sinister, more foreboding. Eddie's entire body tensed, the pressure in his chest increasing, squeezing the air from his lungs. He could feel it now, the weight, not just of the figure, but of the words, pressing down on him like a physical force. The whisper was not just a sound, it was a presence. It was a thing of the storm itself, of the forest, of the very night that had swallowed him whole. It had followed him, it had waited for him, and now it was demanding something from him, something he could not give. He wanted to scream. He wanted to do anything to break the silence, to break the pressure that was pressing down on him from all sides. But his body wouldn't respond. His hands were glued to the steering wheel, his legs locked beneath him. He was helpless, trapped in the grip of something ancient, something that had been waiting in the darkness, in the rain, in the storm. The whisper came again, louder this time, like a breeze brushing against his ear, curling around the words, wrapping them around his very soul. "You shouldn't have stayed." Eddie's breath hitched. He could feel the cold air now, so close, as if it was brushing against his face. His mind screamed for him to look, to turn around, to see what was happening behind him. But he couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to look, and then, as if summoned by his very thoughts, there was movement, a shift, a sound that tore through the silence like a crack of thunder. The figure moved. It was slow, deliberate, like a shadow shifting across the seat. Eddie could feel it, its presence swelling, filling the truck, filling his mind. The cold that had seeped into the truck suddenly intensified, spreading like ice across the cabin. Eddie's breath fogged in the air as a bitter chill surged through him, crawling beneath his skin, wrapping around his limbs like chains. It was as though the storm had entered the truck, becoming part of the very fabric of the vehicle. The figure in the back seat was so close now that Eddie could feel its every movement, its every shift, as if it were breathing down his neck. The whisper came again, louder now, as if it were directly in his ear, the voice sharp, cutting through, the thick silence like a blade. "You should have left." And then there was a sudden crack. The sound was deafening in the quiet cabin, a sharp splintering noise, like wood snapping in two. Eddie's heart skipped a beat, his body jerking in. Response, his hands flying to the window. The truck, his only refuge, his only chance, had shifted. The ground beneath him had buckled, the tires giving way as if the very earth had turned against him. The crack was followed by another sound, a deep, guttural growl. Low, vibrating through the truck's frame, a sound that rumbled from beneath, the floor, from the very foundations of the earth. It was a growl of something ancient, something that had been buried for centuries, waiting to be awakened. Eddie could feel the tremors ripple through the seat, through the truck, as the sound of the storm mingled with something far darker, far more sinister. And then, with a final violent jolt, everything went still. For a brief moment, the truck, the world itself, was silent. But the presence, the figure, it was still there. The whisper lingered in his mind. "You shouldn't have stayed." And Eddie knew then, with absolute certainty, that no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, he would never escape it. The storm wasn't over, it had only just begun. The world inside the truck had become a prison, and the suffocating cold that had filled the cabin only deepened the sensation of confinement. Eddie could feel the chill crawling beneath his skin, numbing his limbs, turning the air to ice. The growl from beneath the truck had rattled his bones as though something ancient had just stirred, something long forgotten, trapped under the earth, now awake and angry. The silence that followed was more unsettling than the growl itself. It was as if the world had paused, no wind, no rain, just an eerie stillness that pressed in from all sides. Eddie's heart raced, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He tried to move, tried to escape this overwhelming weight, but his body refused to cooperate. His limbs felt heavy, as though they were made of lead. The air around him had grown thick, dense, like a fog made of pure dread, and the presence in the back seat loomed larger with every passing second. His hands, slick with sweat, trembled as they clutched the steering wheel. He couldn't bring himself to look, but he knew it was there. It was always there. The rain outside continued, pouring relentlessly against the truck's windows, but the sound had softened, as if the storm were pulling back, retreating into the background, leaving only the sense of something else filling the space. The figure in the back seat hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but Eddie could feel it. He could feel its eyes on him, piercing through the back of his skull, through the fog in his mind. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by the most unnatural sound, a soft, almost imperceptible creak. A sound so subtle that for a split second, Eddie thought he had imagined it. But then it came again. A slow, deliberate squeak, like the sound of someone or something shifting in place, the weight of it pressing against the seat. The air thickened, the weight of it growing heavier, as though the very fabric of the truck had absorbed the presence of the figure, as though the metal and plastic around him had become a cage. The temperature in the cabin plummeted. Eddie could see his breath, a thin mist that curled in front of his face, and yet the window remained fogged, untouched by the moisture that should have been there from the rain. The air itself seemed to be frozen, caught in a moment of time, locked in the storm's grip. The presence was here, suffocating him, holding him in place. The figure in the back seat shifted again, and Eddie finally gathered the courage to look. Through the rearview mirror, he saw the man's form, his silhouette, draped in darkness. His coat billowed outward, as if caught in an unseen wind, though no breeze stirred in the truck. The wide brim of the man's hat obscured his face, but Eddie could still feel those eyes, those hollow, dark pits, piercing through him. The figure had never moved like a normal person. It glided, shifted, slid across the seat like something other. Something that didn't belong in the world Eddie had once known. Eddie's breath caught in his throat, his hands tightening on the wheel, knuckles white. He wasn't just paralyzed by fear. He was being drawn into the presence, like a moth to a flame, caught in something he didn't understand, but couldn't escape. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to break the suffocating hold of the storm and the thing sitting behind him. But his body was betraying him. His eyes couldn't tear away from the mirror, couldn't pull away from the unblinking gaze that was so full of nothing, so full of darkness. It felt like the abyss itself was staring back at him. The silence in the truck was broken by a soft rustle. The figure's coat shifted, the fabric gliding as though it had a life of its own. A deep, slow breath escaped Eddie's lips, a gasp of panic as the figure's gloved hand slowly rose. It wasn't a human hand. No, it was too long, too thin, too wrong. The fingers were like those of an insect, long and spindly, tipped with nails that were impossibly sharp, gleaming in the dim light. The hand reached out toward the rearview mirror, toward Eddie. It wasn't just a hand that reached for him. It was something far deeper, something dark, ancient and cold. Eddie recoiled in his seat, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. His heart hammered in his chest, his throat tight, suffocating. He wanted to scream, but his voice was trapped inside him. His eyes flicked to the window again, but the storm had dimmed the outside world. The rain had softened the storm, muffling the sound of his own racing heart. He couldn't escape this presence. He couldn't even escape his own mind. The hand slowly reached for the mirror, its fingertips brushing against the glass, and Eddie felt the temperature in the truck drop even further. It was as if the very air around him had turned into ice, each breath freezing in his chest. The fingers of the figure's hand glided over the surface of the mirror with a faint scrape, the sound chilling Eddie to his core. It wasn't a natural movement. It was like something out of a nightmare, something that didn't obey the laws of nature. The hand, the figure, was unnatural in every sense of the word. Eddie couldn't breathe. The hand slid upward, tracing the edges of the mirror, and as it moved, Eddie's eyes went wide with horror. The hand was leaving something behind, a smear of blood. But it wasn't just blood. It was dark, too dark, unnaturally so, like the red had soaked into the mirror itself, bleeding across the glass in long, jagged streaks. The figure's fingers trailed the blood across the surface, leaving a bloody handprint in its wake. The smear wasn't just a stain. It was an imprint, a scar that was being etched into the very fabric of Eddie's reality. The reflection in the mirror shifted, twisted. The figure wasn't just behind him anymore. The hand was now at the edge of the mirror. And when Eddie looked at the reflection again, he saw that it wasn't just the figure's hand. He saw the figure's face, or what remained of it. The hat was gone now, the brim lifted, revealing a face so wrong, so hollow, that Eddie's heart nearly stopped. It wasn't a face, it was a skull, hollow and blackened, with empty eye sockets staring back at him. The skin was stretched tight, grey and decayed, as if it had been pulled across bone, with cracks and fissures running through the surface like dried, cracked earth. It was a face made of death, of decay. It was a face that had not seen the light, of the living for years, decades. And the worst part, it wasn't a skull at all. The empty eyes, those dark, hollow pits, were watching him, staring at him. And that smile, it was still there, stretching across the skull's mouth, impossibly wide, almost inhuman. It was a grin that was born from something far darker, something beyond death, beyond decay. It wasn't just a smile. It was a warning. You shouldn't have stayed. The words whispered through Eddie's mind like a breath of ice, wrapping around his skull, sinking into his thoughts, spreading through his veins like poison. And then, with a sudden movement, the figure lunged forward. The cold, icy air rushed around him, filling his lungs, suffocating him. The last thing Eddie saw was the mirror, now completely shattered, the pieces glinting in the light like shards of broken reality. Then, darkness. Eddie's world seemed to collapse in on itself. The darkness that had descended was thick, suffocating, and it swallowed him whole, erasing all sense of time, space, and reality. His mind, once frantic with fear, now felt detached from his body, as though he were floating, disembodied, trapped between one breath and the next. The truck was gone, the storm was gone, and the presence, the figure, was gone. Everything had vanished into the void, leaving only the echo of a whisper in his mind. You shouldn't have stayed. He opened his eyes, or at least he felt like he opened them. The air around him was too heavy, too thick to move through. The weight of it pressed against him, compressing his chest, filling his lungs with cold, stagnant air. But he couldn't breathe. He couldn't feel his body. His limbs were numb, as though they had been frozen in place for eternity, locked in an icy grip that he couldn't escape. He couldn't move. Eddie wanted to scream, but no sound came. His voice felt distant, like it had been severed from his throat, stolen by the very darkness that surrounded him. He wanted to call out for help, to ask what was happening, but the words were trapped in his mind, swallowed by the oppressive silence that now consumed him. It was as though the very world around him had become a void, a vacuum where nothing existed except the weight of his own fear, pressing down on him from all sides. And then, a shift. At first it was subtle, almost imperceptible, a vibration that rippled through the air, the slightest distortion in the void. Eddie felt it before he heard it, a low hum that seemed to crawl beneath his skin, resonating in his bones. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard before. It was ancient. It was primal. It was the hum of something old, something dark, alive. The sound was not physical. It didn't come from a source that could be pinpointed. It was everywhere, filling the space around him, burrowing into his mind. The hum grew louder, deeper, vibrating through Eddie's chest, settling in the pit of his stomach. It was the sound of the storm, of the figure, of everything that had followed him since he first entered the forest. The hum was a part of it all, a constant reminder that something was watching him, waiting for him to break. The sound had no rhythm, no pattern. It simply pulsed, resonating with a force that shook the very fabric of the reality Eddie had once known. Suddenly the darkness around him shifted again. There was no flash of light, no warning, just an overwhelming feeling of movement. Eddie could sense it before he saw it, could feel the presence once again pressing against his skin, seeping into his thoughts. It was like a flood, a rushing tide that swept over him, drowning his senses in cold, suffocating dread. His eyes snapped open, but the world around him remained pitch black. It was no longer the impenetrable darkness he had been in before, though. Now there was something, a shift. It was a small movement in the blackness, a ripple in the void. And then, just beyond the edge of his vision, he saw it. A flicker, a silhouette, a figure standing in the distance, its form barely visible, distorted by the darkness that surrounded it. Eddie's heart stopped. He couldn't make out any details, but he knew. He knew that it was the figure, the same one that had followed him, that had haunted him since the storm first hit. The same one that had watched him, waited for him. And yet, there was something different now. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't gliding through the shadows like before. It was standing still, but it was growing in a way that defied logic. The form stretched upward, expanding, like the darkness itself was folding around. The figure consuming it, bending it to its will. Eddie felt the presence swell, a sudden suffocating force that pressed down on him, pushing him deeper into the abyss. The hum grew louder, more intense, as the figure expanded. The world around. Eddie seemed to ripple with it, warping, distorting, as though reality itself was being twisted, reshaped by the figure's mere existence. The air felt charged, electric, as if something was about to happen. Eddie could feel the pressure in his chest, the weight of it increasing, until it felt like his ribs might crack under the strain. The very air around him had become a living thing, pulsating with energy, vibrating with power, and then the silence broke. A voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It wasn't the faint echo of words lost in the storm. It was clear. It was real. You shouldn't have stayed. The voice was cold, but it was different now. It wasn't just the sound of a figure speaking. It was the sound of something else entirely, something ancient, something alive. The words reverberated in Eddie's chest, shaking him to his core. They weren't just words. They were a force, a command, a warning that cut through the very fabric of reality itself. And then, without warning, everything stopped. The figure, it, stopped growing. The hum ceased. The world around Eddie fell into an eerie silence once again, as if time itself had paused, waiting for something, waiting for him to make the next move. Eddie's body trembled as he stood in the dark, unable to move, unable to scream. His mind raced, but the thoughts wouldn't form. The world around him had become a blur, a fractured reality that twisted and contorted, as though it was no longer governed by the laws of nature. It was all slipping away, fading into the blackness. He felt himself being pulled, tugged, by some unseen force. His body was no longer his own. The presence around him was taking him, dragging him deeper into the abyss, closer to whatever lay beyond. It was like drowning, but without the water. It was like falling, but without the ground. The pressure in his chest intensified. The hum vibrated through him, pulsing with an unholy rhythm, and then he was moving, not by his own will, but by the will of the figure, of the storm, of whatever had been following him all this time. The force that had been building in the darkness was now in full control, and Eddie was nothing but a passenger, helpless as he was drawn toward it, toward the presence, toward whatever it was that had been waiting for him. And then, just as quickly, as it had begun, everything snapped. The air shifted, Eddie's mind shattered, and the storm returned. But this time, it wasn't just the rain. This time, the storm had a voice. The sky opened, the thunder cracked, and Eddie knew, in that final moment, that whatever had followed him had claimed him. He was no longer in control. The storm's roar exploded into Eddie's mind like 1,000 thunderclaps, the force of it shaking him to his very core. The world around him, the truck, the forest, the storm, collapsed into an overwhelming, chaotic noise, a howl of wind, rain, and dark, suffocating pressure. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick, as though it was saturated with something heavy, something old and unnatural. His lungs burned, but no matter how hard he tried to gasp, the air refused to fill his chest. The storm had become part of him, filling his entire being with its fury, its rage, its endless oppressive force. Eddie's body jerked, his mind swirling in an endless spiral of confusion and terror. The truck, the storm, the figure, it all felt like a fever dream now, a nightmare that had swallowed his entire reality whole. He could feel the presence pressing in on him from all sides, closing in, suffocating him, until it felt as though the storm itself had become a living, breathing thing. A force that moved with a mind of its own, with a hunger that couldn't be satiated. He tried to move, but his limbs felt like lead. His hands were frozen to the steering wheel, his body immobilized by something beyond fear. The whispers, the chilling words, "You shouldn't have stayed," still echoed in his mind, louder now, more insistent, as though they were being spoken directly into his thoughts, filling his very consciousness with their meaning. It was too late. There was no escape. No way out. And then, a break. The storm stopped. Just like that, the violent winds died down, the thunder retreated into the distance, and the rain softened to a gentle mist. The air grew still, too still, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Eddie could hear the faintest sound, the rhythmic beating of his own heart. His body still trembled, but the storm around him had paused, as though it were waiting, watching for something to happen. Eddie couldn't understand it. He didn't know if he was still in the truck, or if he had slipped into another world, another reality where the laws of nature had no meaning. Everything felt wrong, disjointed, fractured, like he was in between worlds, caught in some liminal space where nothing made sense. The air was thick with anticipation, a suffocating silence hanging in the balance, like the earth itself was holding its breath. He dared to look around. The truck had become something else. The familiar metal shell, that had once been his sanctuary now felt like a tomb, a cold, hollowed-out cage. The seats, the dashboard, the floor, all of it had warped. The colors were drained, the textures twisted, as though the very fabric of the truck had been distorted, pulled apart by an unseen hand. The windows, once clear, were now covered in a strange, viscous fog that clung to the glass like some organic substance, slick and unnatural. Eddie reached for the door handle, his fingers slipping against the cold metal, but his hand froze mid-motion. The figure was there. It wasn't just in the back seat anymore. It had shifted. It had become the very air around him, woven into the truck, the storm, the very essence of the forest. The figure was everywhere now, its presence so pervasive, so overwhelming, that Eddie could feel it in his skin, in his bones, in the very air he breathed. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't outrun it. He was trapped, bound to this place, to the storm, to whatever had been waiting for him all along. The figure didn't speak this time. It didn't need to. Its hollow eyes, those endless pits of darkness, were fixed on Eddie, but now the empty gaze wasn't just cold, it was knowing. It was as though the figure saw through him, into the deepest parts of his soul, stripping away every layer of humanity, every ounce of fear, until there was nothing left. The figure wasn't just a presence anymore, it was a force, a manifestation of something far greater, something older than time itself. It had been waiting for him, watching him, drawing him in. The truck groaned beneath him, the metal creaking as though the very structure of it was being pulled apart. Eddie's mind raced. His body was rigid with terror, but there was no way to escape. No way to fight what was happening. The figure was everywhere, its presence filling the space with a cold that went beyond temperature. It was the kind of cold that came from the death of something. Something long gone, buried in time. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the presence shifted. It wasn't in the truck anymore. Eddie was alone. The truck was silent again, but the world outside had changed. The storm had disappeared, but in its place was a vast, empty expanse. The trees were gone. The forest had vanished, and Eddie was no longer on the road. The truck sat on a desolate plain, a field of blackened earth stretching endlessly in all directions. There was no sky, only an endless dark void above him, an expanse of nothingness, as if the heavens themselves had been consumed by the darkness. He looked around, but there was nothing. No wind, no rain, no sound, just silence. A silence so deep, so suffocating, that it felt as though the entire world had gone dead. And in that silence, Eddie realized the truth. He had never been on the road. He had never been in the truck. The storm, the forest, the figure. It had all been a part of something far more insidious, something far more ancient. He hadn't been driving through the woods. He had been trapped in a world, a place, created by the figure, by the storm, by the force that had been waiting for him. And now, it was over. There was no escape. And then, as the realization settled over him like a weight, the whisper came, again, "You shouldn't have stayed." But this time, Eddie understood. It wasn't a warning, it was a truth. Eddie had never been meant to leave. He had never been meant to escape. And now he was part of the storm, part of the figure, part of whatever force had called him here. He had become part of the eternal darkness that stretched out before him, stretching endlessly into the void. The last breath he took was not his own. And as the void closed in around him, he realized he was just another shadow, another lost soul waiting for someone else to wander too far into the storm, and they would never escape. The silence was complete, and Eddie was gone.